Welcome back, degenerates, degeneritas, and acclaimed members of the Degenerati to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 295, Jones Miocic. Oh, wait. Sorry, UFC 309, Jones versus Miocic. The pay-per-view over a year in the making. Live from Madison Square Garden. I have to be honest, this is maybe the most oversold isn't quite the word I want to use, but I do think that this is a grossly overrated pay-per-view in terms of hype, particularly coming off of the last pay-per-view, which I said on the last RAXPOD I thought was arguably the deepest show, deepest card of the year other than UFC 300. And I think that largely came to pass. You can make an argument for UFC 299 as well, but those three cards all, I think, had better lineups going for them than what this one does. Overall, in terms of depth, I think it's pretty decent. There's a lot of competitively lined fights on the prelims, actually, and I'm going to be totally honest, that is really what I'm more interested in going into this event. Because you look at the 5-fight lineup that the main card has, and the most competitively lined fight right now is the fight between, or the most competitively lined fight right now is a fight that is a rematch, a lower stakes rematch. And I'm going to get into that when it's time to talk about the co-main event, because obviously, if you listen to the show before, you know how near and dear Charles Oliveira is to my heart as a fan and as a bettor, but especially in terms of rekindling my interest in the sport. He's been a pivotal figure, and I look forward to talking about his rematch with Michael Chandler later on in the show. However, the fact that Oliveira is effectively a 2.5-to-1 favorite, and that is the most competitively lined fight on the main card, speaks to how this is really just more of a card about putting stars and names over, at least with respect to the main card. The prelims, I think, are much more captivating, and I look forward to talking about a lot of those. So before we get into that, I will touch real quickly on UFC Vegas 100, because, I mean, my goodness. You know, if you read that post that I made last week, I obviously had some feelings about the event even before all of the cancellations and whatnot going into it, just because it was, it was a reflection of where we got to we've been watching all these events this year, and it just feels like there's been a recurring theme of, just the UFC trying to get the bare minimum out of these non-pay-per-view events and not really striving to deliver their fans more. People have chalked it up to filling the ESPN allotment for their contract with respect to putting on weekly events. I think there's probably some truth to that, but I think what it really more is comes down to the cost effectiveness of putting on all these apex events where you can control a lot of the elements, given the fact that it's taking place effectively in the UFC headquarters. And you're consistently dealing with the Nevada State Athletic Commission, which you have the most familiarity in dealing with if you are the UFC brass. But it's obvious that the decision makers at the UFC are much more keen on hosting events at the Apex than fans are for tuning in, or fighters are even for participating. I do want to read this post back that I wrote last week in case you missed it, because it really sums up my thoughts on the event as a whole before it even happened, and kind of why I was considering passing up on it from a betting perspective last week, and ultimately should have made that decision. It would have been, I think, the 5th card this year that I've passed on, all of which have been at the Apex, ultimately because we only have 4 events this year, including this pay-per-view, I decided to play it anyway. And that was a mistake, I guess. But it was also me being influenced by the fact that the last card that I skipped, I would have made profit on with the parlay that I suggested to people. That was Fight Night Burns versus Brady. My memory's a bit short at the moment in terms of the other 2 legs that I put out for that night, but I know that I made Sean Brady one of them. And, hindsight's 20/20. He cruised in a way that I didn't really anticipate, and I don't think a lot of people, even the people that bet on Brady, did. But like I said, hindsight is 20/20. But there was some remorse in terms of not playing that event, and that was part of what influenced me to want to participate in this one as one of the last 5 of the year. But I had to really think about it, and this post that I made, in case you missed it, I think really summarizes why. So I wrote this, I believe, on Thursday, so the night before weigh-ins. So I said, as UFC Vegas 100 approaches this weekend, it's time to have a serious discussion about what kind of an impact the UFC Apex has on the exposure and growth of mixed martial arts in the United States of America. The cancellation of Miles Johns versus Cody Garbrandt this week means half of the last 8 Apex Fight Night cards have had a co-main event called off. This is now the 66th fight on an Apex card this year that has suffered a non-rebooking or rescheduling cancellation. Earlier this week, Nicholas Dalby versus Alizu Zaleski dos Santos became the 42nd fight cancellation due to withdrawal without an immediately specified reason. UFC Vegas 100 will be the 17th fight night event at the Apex this year. That means each Apex card in 2024 has averaged nearly 4 total cancellations and 2.5 unspecified withdrawals per event. Given many of these cancellations tend to happen during the week of the card, this drain on talent almost certainly has a depreciable effect on the potential viewing audience. Several members of the UFC roster have also professed frustration themselves with having to fight in this environment as opposed to in front of an actual arena crowd. But the UFC, understandably, continues to schedule a wealth of fight night events at the Apex at the expense of road shows due to cost efficiency and ease of consistently working with the Nevada State Athletic Commission. However, at a certain point, when does the prioritization of short-term profit begin to hinder prospective long-term gains? As high as the ceiling may be for the future of MMA in America and beyond, this sport almost certainly cannot grow to its greatest potential if so many of the leading promotions' non-pay-per-view events continue to take place in a glorified warehouse. Attracting casual fans becomes much more difficult when disinterested fighters routinely call off their bouts to the detriment of cards left shallow of talent. Only half of the 12 remaining fights on UFC Vegas 100 feature a pair of athletes that have each made multiple previous UFC appearances. The main card features just 2 of these, and the favorite in the main event currently sits at a minus 850 price tag. This card has devolved into a tragically poetic reflection of the Apex at its worst, while the venue prepares to celebrate its triple-digit milestone. At its best, fans have had a handful of intimate wars to witness, such as the incredible battle between Dustin Poirier and Dan Hooker at the main event of UFC Vegas 4. But even such heights in the Apex's history have left fans wondering if that clash could have produced an even greater impression on MMA fans with a crowd to bear witness to its glory. Earlier this year, Dana White declared in a press conference following UFC St. Louis that we got to get out of the Apex and start doing more events in all these different cities. A report emerged in August that the UFC Apex would shut down in November for renovations until at least the middle of next year. But the UFC Apex has already, or the UFC has already announced UFC Vegas 101 for January 11th to open the promotion's event schedule in 2025. That event was to feature a fight between Germaine de Randamie and Jacqueline Cavalcanti until the former featherweight champion announced her retirement last week. Put another way, the first Apex fight of the year and 67th across the last 18 events at the venue has already been canceled. At what point will the UFC decide to stop impeding the progress and spread of its own sport in its home country? How much more benefit can there really be for the promotion from Apex shows at the expense of cities craving for the UFC to bring them a card? Until the answers to those questions become plainly apparent to all involved, fighters and fans alike will continue to endure events such as this weekend. The light of the future for MMA remains unobscurable in its brilliance, but the potential shine for the sport remains hindered by the octagonal prism of the Apex prison. Less than 24 hours after I made that post, Bernardo Sopage versus Ricky Turcios was called off after both fighters weighed in due to a Turcios medical issue. So that's 67 cancellations across the last 17 UFC Vegas events. And the fifth co-main across the last 8 Apex cards since UFC Vegas 93. Now, the even greater tragedy from my perspective was that after the card took place, because people were so desperate to see finishes, at least the people that actually tuned in, the narrative coming out of this event was that it actually surpassed expectations, and a lot of people felt satisfied with the results. You know, neglecting the fact that the favorite in the main event was a minus 850 favorite at one point. Neglecting the fact that Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos was fighting a last-minute replacement that couldn't make the 170-pound limit and looked grossly outmatched and probably won't even might get another shot just for the fact that he did the company a favor. But most people agreed watching him perform against Zaleski dos Santos that I believe Zach Scroggin was his name, was not really cut out for UFC level. So here's the problem. If you're a casual fan's not going to tune in to watch, 37-year-old Zaleski dos Santos fight some guy that they just signed. There's not enough interest for that. A hardcore is going to eat that up because, what else are they going to watch? They're already committed to watching the leading MMA promotion every week. But if you're a hardcore fan and your bar, your bare minimum, your standard for satisfaction in watching these events is just seeing a finish, like if you've resigned yourself to being content with that, what is stopping the UFC from just making every fight night like the one that just happened? If the goal is just to generate finishes, why would they not just make UFC veterans fight last-minute fill-in scrubs at every opportunity to guarantee a result that you're going to react more positively to than if they scheduled a more competitive fight that had the potential to go the distance? That's just not going to cut it. But unfortunately, based on the positive reaction that was coming out of this event because of the wealth of finishes, the UFC is going to see that, and they're probably going to schedule more of shows like that accordingly. So, I mean, the fact that we keep hearing that, we got to get out of the Apex and do more road shows, and to their credit, it feels like they're doing at least more road shows in the second half of this year than they did in the first half. We had Edmonton a couple of weeks ago. We've got Macau next week. We're ending the year with Tampa Bay. So we are at least done with the Apex for the year, and we've gradually seen more and more UFC events taking place outside of the Apex as the year has gone on. But the reality is we still got 17 cards this year that happened at the Apex of the, I think we get somewhere close to like 40 a year. So nearly half of and that's including pay-per-views. So you take away, you get 12 pay-per-views, let's say a year, you'd subtract those from the 40-something events that we do get. And it's probably a little more than 40, but it might not be. I don't know. We'll say 40 just as a ballpark. So, you take away 12 pay-per-views from that 40 total, you've got 28 events. You've got 17 of those 28 events. That's only barely over 10 events that are happening in actual cities on non-pay-per-views. That's terrible for growing this sport. And I have to wonder how much of them trying to run these cost control events I'm sure the short-term profit margin is probably better, and given the ongoing litigation relative to fighter pay, I wonder how much of this is them just trying to squeeze the most profit while the parameters are set as they are for them to make as much money as they can, trying to get the lemon for all the juice it's worth, so to speak, while they still have the opportunity to do so. But in terms of the long term, part of the reason I got into this was because I recognized that, this sport was in such a young stage of its growth cycle that I was optimistic that starting a content platform, the platform would be able to grow in tandem with the sport. And it kind of feels like I've been able to grow it in spite of the sport kind of stifling itself in the 2 years that I've been doing this. And I just wonder, at one point, is the UFC going to snap itself out of the COVID? It's crazy to look back like 5 years ago pre-COVID and see that there were fight night events where, like, I can't remember which one it was specifically, but I remember looking back and seeing like there was a fight night event where Holloway defended his featherweight title at one point. And it's like we were getting title fights on these fight night events pre-COVID, and now we're just getting this Apex slop. So the UFC has the capacity to do higher level matchmaking for these non-pay-per-view events than what we've gotten. At what point are they actually going to start doing that? It's I don't know when that's actually going to take place. Maybe it won't happen until after the litigation wraps up relative to the ongoing fighter pay lawsuits and class action suits. I know one of them is awaiting approval or final judge approval on a settlement that already got turned down once and now is apparently a little more favorable, but we'll see if the judge thinks that it's enough for the fighters, because the fighters were willing to settle the first time and the judge still thought it was too much of a predatory situation to where he wasn't willing to sign off on it. And that only resolves one of the two suits that they have. So it could be a while before we actually get a final resolution on those cases, and then the UFC is ready to put that behind them and move forward with whatever the future direction of fighter pay is in MMA. But feels like until that happens, we're going to be stuck with a lot of Apex slop. And it's not very encouraging that we got, quotes from Dana White earlier this year saying we do need to get back out on the road. You've got other executives at the UFC doing these post-fight press conferences where they're saying, yeah, we're not going to do as many Apex events going forward. The Apex is going to close for construction for the early part of next year at least, is what they said in August. And we've already got UFC Vegas 101 lined up for the first event in January of next year. So it's, actions speak louder than words. And I don't necessarily feel super encouraged by it. The problem is, like I said, I can't skip every Apex event for the sake of betting, even though that would have probably helped me out quite a bit this year. But the thing is, the most profitable event I've ever had doing this was an Apex event last year. So it's more of just that I don't want to chalk it up to me just being not as successful with these lower level fights where the fighters that I'm evaluating have lower statistical sample sizes, so the results have more variance. I don't think that that's really what the case is. At the end of the day, it comes down to the reads that you make and the confidence that you put in certain spots. So I think I've been much better doing that outside of the Apex this year than in it. And I should have kept that in mind last week before deciding to play this. I lost 3 picks last week, so I was only down to like 5. The difference between this and other events that I skipped earlier this year was a lot of the other Apex events that I didn't play this year, I didn't have like multiple underdog picks that I could feel good about. So I ultimately decided, that I can't really there's not enough picks for me to attach units to where even with diversifying my exposure risk that it makes it worth it for me to invest units into this card. So I should just skip it entirely. The difference with this one was I had 3 different underdog spots that I felt like I think at least one of these should probably hit. And for my entire betting career, I mean, my record picking underdogs at this point is just over 50%. I was running a little bit hot with underdogs, not only this year, but really in the second half of this year. So I did think also, and this was part of what almost dissuaded me from betting this card, was going into it. I was thinking, okay, even though I think one of these should at least hit, I am running a little bit hot on underdogs for this year. So what should I really, is it worth it for me to stay on or get off? But for my entire time I've been doing this, I'm hitting it a little bit over 50%, which is great because that means if you give me 2 fights that are at plus odds on average, I'm going to hit one of them, and that'll mean that I come out profitable. But that wasn't the case last week. All 3 of my underdog spots hit. But as I'm going to get into later on in this card, because I know there's one underdog I'm taking in particular that I'm sure many people are kind of raising their eyebrow at. Plus money's plus money. It's like I've said for a very long time. If you are too afraid of what the odds are communicating relative to your own confidence in a pick, you're never going to end up finding plus value, and you're not going to be a successful underdog bettor, and you're going to lean too heavily on chalk. And that's coming from somebody that put out Kyler Phillips at minus 450 earlier this year and played Tatsuro Taira at minus 300 after putting him out at minus 225. I'm never going to chastise somebody that looks at a plus odds money line and can make a compelling case for their bet. If you think that you've got the potential to hit on something, you've got confidence in the fighter that goes contrary to the market, you should have the confidence to play that. It's something I learned when I would shy away from underdogs to hedge on rounds in ways that I thought were more confident. Then I get the pick wrong, and and the fighter that I originally thought was going to win wins anyway, and I kind of get filled with that remorse in terms of like, oh, I should have just played the underdog. It's better for you to just play the underdog. If you see a guy at plus odds and your gut feels good about it, roll with it. That mentality has gotten me to over 50% lifetime betting on underdogs at this point. And you know what? It didn't work out last week, but the week before that, I think I hit on all but I didn't count Pedro Munoz at Edmonton as an underdog because I put him out at pick'em odds, even though he eventually floated out to plus money. But I did go, I'm calling it 2 for 3 in terms of, Romanov. I put him out as an underdog before the line flipped after the weigh-in. Bredson Ribeiro was a definite underdog against Caio Machado. And then Garrett Armfield was the one in that 3 that didn't hit, but obviously most people that aren't obvious Canadian homers would tell you that Armfield won that fight. So it is what it is. But last week, the plus odds weren't in my they just didn't shake out for me. The Trockley fight was kind of a meme guillotine. It is what it is. Although, people were openly questioning what Trockley's fight IQ was anyway. And yeah, I mean, for a guy that's never been submitted, that's a pretty embarrassing way to, let yourself get snatched up. Standing guillotines are dangerous, but you would think for fighters at that level, it's also pretty easy to protect your neck in a standing position on the fence as opposed to on the ground, and especially when that's the way that Gore won his last fight. You would think he would have been more hip to defending that. If you watched any tape on his opponent whatsoever who hadn't fought in, 2 years, but it is what it is there. The fight that I should mention before we get into UFC 309, because I always talk about the favorites that I miss on, was Cortavius Romeus and Gaston Bolaños. And this was really the biggest reason that I should have stayed off last week. in talking about the UFC continuing to put these low-level fights together, there's kind of a narrative that's emerged that you should always be feting these like juiced up Dana White's Contender Series guys, and juiced up referring to betting odds, not gear or what, or if you want to call it that. But Romius, the thing that I thought was interesting was that, yeah, this guy didn't land any takedowns in either of his Contender Series appearances and got sparked pretty badly in his first one. But, Bolaños is someone that I've faded before, and this guy doesn't have any submission wins. The difference in ring rust is pretty crazy. I think that I can understand why the fight is lined the way that it is. And generally, when you're betting the more well-rounded side, you're going to get, the fighter that has the more well-rounded skill set is the one that comes out victorious in a fight that goes 15 minutes. That fight, I didn't like the judging on it at all. I thought it was kind of ridiculous that Romius didn't get a single round scored for him. Most people were more upset that one of the judges scored at 30-26, which was also ridiculous in its own right. But the fact that Romius didn't get credit for hurting Bolaños pretty badly at the end of the first round, the fact that none of the judges rewarded him hurting Bolaños at the beginning of the second round, but then kind of, instead of capitalizing on pushing him back against the fence, shooting a takedown into the fence and then taking his back, and then eventually halfway through the round, after not being able to get a choke, conceding control, letting Bolaños back into the fight. And then the fight kind of ran away with it from there. I wonder how much Romius thought the fight was 1-1 versus 2-0 going into the third, because I think that if he did realize that it wasn't 1-1, he was down 2 rounds going into the third, if he would have fought with more urgency. It was a letdown performance. I mean, they happen, but I think it was not only was it a letdown performance, but it was surprising to see how much improvement Bolaños had made on the ground relative to the fighter that he had been before that appearance. I don't think most people that watched that fight anticipated that Bolaños would do as well on the ground as he did, particularly given how much success Romius had on the ground in his second Contender Series fight, despite the fact that he didn't get any knockdowns, that he basically had to fight his way out of dominant positions and get reversals and turn the fight in his favor, despite not putting it on the ground on his own terms, and was able to get a contract as a result of that. It was a letdown performance. I was kind of put in a precarious position relative to having to back Bolaños, just because I didn't have any other favorites that I could invest confidently in other than Damon Blackshear after Miles Johns' fight with Cody Garbrandt fell out, after we lost the Dalby Dos Santos fight. And then I wanted to include Sopaj against Tercios, but then that fight fell out too. So after those 3 week of cancellations, I should have just said, all right, I don't want anything to do with this card. This is a mess. Because that's what I did in August for Vegas 90. I can't remember if it was 96 or 97, but it was the one before Burns Brady. And I said, you know what, I don't need anything to do with this. And I ended up missing out on an event that I would have lost money on anyway, which is what I've done on all but one of the Apex events that I skipped this year. So hindsight's 2020, but it is what it is. We move on. Going forward, maybe don't invest in favorites that you think are going to have the ground advantage, but didn't actually land any takedowns on Contender Series. But again, hindsight's 2020, and I didn't think that, I just didn't expect Bolaños to make as many improvements during his time off as he did in that realm. So good for him that he figured it out. Okay, that was almost a half hour before actually getting to this event, which is, I know, what I did last time. So if you have been listening, thank you very much. I appreciate you sticking around. I promise I am going to talk about the actual pay-per-view at this point, but had a lot of thoughts on the Apex generally that I wanted to get out there, as we are trying to move on from UFC Vegas 100. One last thing that I just want to briefly mention, a couple housekeeping notes before I jump into that, is just some quick real life stuff. I know I've been skipping out on doing the minute to win it breakdowns the last couple of events. I'm glad I didn't do them for last week because like half of the fights ended up getting canceled anyway that I would have made content for that would have ended up being worthless. But it's going to be kind of hard to commit to doing those going into next year too. I just want to be transparent because I did just take a full-time offer for a writing editing gig with a publicly traded company, and the hours, even though I don't want to call them scary, I am going to be having to make some sleep cycle adjustments relative to what I've been dealing with for most of this year. It's more money than I made when I was producing for gambling content for USA Today and the Miami Herald and a bunch of other outlets across the U.S., so that's nice. And again, it is continuing my writing and editing career in a full-time capacity, but even though I'm still going to be, putting out picks routinely and everything, and I think I should be able to swing doing the RAXPOD when I get home from work and then producing it before I'm putting out as well. Minute to win it, it's going to be harder to commit to, so that's going to be more sporadic going forward if you've been tuning in for those. I know like half of the subscribers that I've gotten, certainly almost all of the ones this year have been off of those minute to win it breakdowns, so I just wanted to be transparent. Yeah. And then the last note, I turning 31 the day after you'll be listening to this. So I'm celebrating a birthday this week. So just wanted to mention that. All right. Thank you very much. That's enough talking about stuff that isn't the pay-per-view. We've got 10 fights to go over, 9 picks, and let's get into it because, like I said, I'm more enthusiastic for these prelims than I am for the actual pay-per-view. So we will kick things off with Oban Elliott and Bassil Hafez. Elliott enters 11-2, last appeared at UFC 304, Edwards vs. Muhammad 2, when he fought Preston Parsons as an underdog, taking that fight by unanimous decision. I was one of the only people that put out Elliott as an underdog that week. I know there were, a couple, maybe handful of other people across the MMA Twitterverse that did so, but going into the week, I really did not notice anybody else backing Elliott confidently. Elliott was also part of my sweep at UFC 298 earlier this year when he was something like a 3-1 favorite over Val Woodburn. And also won on Contender Series in what was a bit of a comeback performance last year. He is on a 7-fight win streak now. What's curious is the last 6 of his fights have all gone to decision after none of his fights went the distance while he was competing in Cage Warriors for the earlier stages of his MMA career. And he is now the pride of the Shore MMA Center after what happened to Jack Shore at UFC Edmonton. So Elliott, the Welsh fighter, now the pride of that nation in the UFC. Bassil Hafez enters 9-3-1, last fought at UFC 302. At that event, I was a Morono fight away from making about 40 units on that pay-per-view. He and the main event, I think, were the only 2 picks that I missed that event. One of the fights that I made a leg was Hafez's fight against Gall, where I didn't take Hafez as like a 400 favorite because I recognized that line was kind of outrageous, but I did feel pretty good that Hafez, who has never been finished, was not going to get finished by Gall. But also I hadn't really seen enough from Hafez to believe that he was going to be able to dispatch Gall himself. And Gall gave a pretty good account of himself in the earlier stages of that fight, but Hafez was able to battle back into it and get, I believe, a 29-28 unanimous decision. I took the plus 2.5 rounds at what was close to a pick'em price, feeling pretty good that I was going to go the distance. And I remember walking to the bar to watch 302 and having that fight kind of on my phone and glancing down at it every now and again, feeling pretty good that, I could probably just let this one go. I don't really need to watch it, but just in case something happens, I just kind of want it in my peripheral, but nothing ended up coming to pass. Hafez's only other UFC appearance was a short notice debut in the co-main event of Fight Night Holm versus Bueno Silva in July of last year. That was a split decision that honestly could have gone either way. But the Jack Della Maddalena faithful will tell you that he very handily won that fight in the same way that he handily won the fight against Gilbert Burns. But Hafez did kind of expose JDM as not having the greatest ground game, which Gilbert Burns was able to then further capitalize on until he got knocked out in the final stages of their own fight. But Hafez gave a pretty good account of himself in that one, even though JDM didn't really have much to offer him coming back in the wrestling and grappling department. I don't have a ton to say about this one, even though I just gave, a nearly 4-minute intro on the recent history of both of these guys. I think, Hafez being as big of a favorite as he was over Gall and then not winning that fight convincingly 30-27 kind of tells you why he's lined as the underdog here, despite the fact that he had the performance against Jack Della Maddalena that he did. He is presumably, you look at the statistical advantages that Hafez has just based on his previous 2 performances. It looks like he's going to be the busier striker, but he was very, very close on significant strikes with Mickey Gall, which is surprising given Gall's really got more of a rep for being a grappler, even though Gall is now, I believe, a Killcliff FC. So in the 2-year layoff that he had between his appearance against Mike Malone and his fight against Hafez, it did appear that he at least made a little bit of improvement in that department, but again, based on the price that Hafez was at, you would have expected him to kind of pour it on more than he did. His defensive numbers are still, I think, skewed pretty badly from the Della Maddalena fight, but he really did not outland Gall significantly when they fought. So you can certainly make the case that he's much more hittable and less defensively responsible than Elliott. Even though Elliott, if you're going to talk about guys fighting grapplers, I think most people were expecting Parsons to kind of like pressure wrestle and control Elliott on the ground, and that's why he was the favorite when they fought at UFC 304 earlier this year. I was willing to give Elliott's takedown defense the benefit of the doubt and recognize that Parsons was kind of one-dimensional, having no knockout wins in his MMA career to this point. Hafez only has 1 knockout on his own record, to be fair, but it was a 1-punch knockout at the very end of the fight in Fury Fighting Championships, which was the last appearance that he made before he took the Della Maddalena fight on short notice. So there's a case for Hafez having some power in his hands here that I think is keeping, at least in my own evaluation, I think is keeping the line closer than it would be otherwise, because there is the potential for Elliott to get knocked out here, given he does have 2 knockout losses previously on his record, although thankfully at least neither of them came in the first round. The most recent one was in the final minute of the second round in what was his 6th career appearance, and he was also knocked out in the final round of his 4th fight with Cage Warrior. So, Hafez having not being finished, you would think has the edge in attrition here, so that's also in his favor. He's got a little bit more experience going the distance. However, Elliott, as I alluded to in the beginning, the craziest thing about the winning streak he's on right now is that it's almost entirely comprised of decisions for a fighter that prior to going on the streak had never gone the distance. So Elliott still at this stage has never lost a fight that has gone to the scorecards, and the closest fight that he had in that capacity was his Contender Series appearance, and each of his previous 2 appearances since he fought on Contender Series against presumably higher level competition than, I don't know if Val Woodburn is better than Kai. I don't want to mispronounce that name because it's going to sound like a slur if I say it wrong. Against Brito on Contender Series. I don't know if Woodburn's better than that guy, but Preston Parsons certainly a higher level opponent than either of those two. And actually his first loss in his MMA career was to Michael Figlak, who did compete on a UFC card earlier this year. I believe was favored over Austin Hubbard and lost a decision that many people were not thrilled with. I took Hubbard as an underdog and got kind of bailed out by bad judging, I'm willing to admit. That being said, Elliott, I think that as long as he doesn't get like me knocked out here, which would be Hafez's second knockout of his MMA career, I think that his greater defensive responsibility is going to give him the opportunities to land more impactful shots on Hafez over the course of 15 minutes. He just needs to avoid that one-shot KO. And his takedown defense at 72%, I think, is good enough where he's going to be able to resist the pressure wrestling of Hafez. It's possible that Hafez has more success earlier in the fight while he's fresher, but I don't anticipate him to maintain the effectiveness of his shots relative to takedowns as the fight goes on, kind of like what happened with Della Maddalena, where there was just less polish as the fight went on, and Maddalena was able to kind of more effectively stifle the takedown attempts and was clearly getting the better of him in the standing exchanges. And Elliott also showed, to the surprise of a lot of people and even me, having picked him when he fought at UFC 304, he's 26 years old. He's at the stage where he can be rapidly making improvements between fights. And I think that is going to suit him well here as he's getting the matchup with Hafez. One thing I didn't really realize going into this, I guess, is Hafez is a little bit of a local guy, so it is possible that he's going to have the crowd more firmly in his side in the earlier stages. But I still think that the striking upside here, outside of the brief glimpse of one-punch power we've seen from Hafez, is more in Elliott's favor just because of the better defensive numbers. On the ground, I think Hafez will probably enjoy success earlier in the fight, but as the fight goes on, he's not going to be able to rely on that nearly as much. And I would expect Elliott to get something resembling a 29-28 decision win here. The 7th straight decision in his MMA career, and continue the good momentum he has going. So give me Elliott to win a 29-28 unanimous decision. I won't be surprised if it's a little bit closer than that, maybe at a split. But I don't expect him to be the one to finish Hafez or give Hafez his first loss by finish. If it does happen, I think it probably happens later in the fight when Hafez has kind of gassed himself out after an exhausting amount of takedown attempts, kind of similar to what happened against Jack Della Maddalena. So give me Oban Elliott to win by 29-28 unanimous decision. The next fight is Mickey Gall and Ramiz Brahimaj. Gall enters 7-6. His last fight was the aforementioned bout with Bassil Hafez at UFC 302, in which he lost a unanimous decision, but gave a better account of himself than his plus 300, 350 price tag would have implied. Was much more competitive in the striking than I think anybody expected, and that came off of a I don't know if you want to call a late career switch, because the guy is 32, but he is one of the only fighters that you'll see that has spent almost their entire MMA career in the UFC. He only has one appearance outside of the UFC, And I think a big part of that was them kind of setting him up to fight CM Punk all the way back in 2016 at this point. Really has not been super active. Obviously hadn't made an appearance for 2 years prior to competing at UFC 302 this past June. But, you know, you can say something similar for his opponent, Brahimaj, and we'll get into that. But prior to that, Gall hadn't fought since April of 2022. I talked about that card when I was breaking down the Chimaev-Whitaker fight on the last RAXPOD, that whole event, UFC 273, that taking the over on Gall versus Malo was the fight that snapped the longest winning streak I've had since I started doing this. So that fight lives long in the memory, but it was also the over, I believe, was at plus money, so I don't really sweat it too bad long term. And prior to that, had lost to Alex Morono by unanimous decision at the end of 2021. Has not won since he submitted Jordan Williams in July, over 3 years ago. And the best win on his entire UFC career is probably still him against Sage Northcutt all the way back in December of 2016, even with Northcutt being very green as grass in his own MMA career at that point. Conversely, Brahimaj made his first appearance in over 2 years earlier this year at Fight Night Barboza versus Murphy. He was, I think, a more closely lined favorite than a lot of people expected against Themba Gorimbo. I think I made Gorimbo a parlay leg that night. I know that I at least picked Gorimbo. I didn't really understand the optimism about Brahimaj at all, and he put forth a really, really dreadful performance, which makes, I think, it interesting that, you know, this fight now with Gall is lined as closely as it is. I'm going to be totally honest, and this is going to sound like a very, very sicko thing to say, but maybe strictly from a betting perspective, I am more intrigued by this fight than I am the main event of the pay-per-view. The main event of the pay-per-view, I think is incredibly predictable what's going to happen, and we'll get into that when the time comes. This fight is so much more interesting to me because these are two guys. This is very much a loser gets cut situation. These are two guys that prior to this year had not been active over the last 2 years. These are guys that are primarily grapplers that are still developing their striking, that have a lot of question marks about their UFC and their MMA careers overall. And it's very, very difficult to get a read on who is going to be able to come out victorious. And for those reasons, that sort of unpredictability makes me more intrigued about what's going to happen, particularly given for most of this week, this fight has been lined at a pick'em. Gall is starting to gradually become a little bit wider of a favorite. But when I put the pick out earlier this week, he was like minus 128. Now he's gradually floating into the minus 130, 140 range. And I know a lot of people that are picking Brahimaj, and I just don't really understand why, given the most recent performances that these two have had. Gall, arguably, I've heard some people say that Brahimaj like has the better level of competition he's faced than Gall. Gall fought Randy Brown in 2017. He fought Mike Perry in 2020. And, you know, it wasn't that long ago that Alex Morono was actually pretty decent before his damage tolerance just started to totally go out the window. And, I mean, Mike Malo was, you know, a much more heralded name, I think, or at least much more heralded prospect prior to the disaster against Neil Magny. Was a better version of himself, at least. I think the fight after that win over Mickey Gall, Malo ended up being the co-main event at UFC 289, which was about a year later. No, so he fought after that, almost a year later, he fought Johan Lioness and then fought Adam Fugit in what I believe was the co-main event at UFC 289, if not on the main card, because they were trying to push him as the Canadian guy. But again, I still feel like Gall has fought at least as good of a schedule as Brahimaj has, if not better. Brahimaj's only 2 UFC wins have both been against fighters that have not had any submission wins in MMA. Michael Gilmore, by the way, Brahimaj's fight with Michael Gilmore was the first fight that I ever had I ever made a pick for with MMA Rax. Not publicly, but I've spoken before about how Makhachev Green was the first event where I started doing analysis. So in terms of me tracking my picks, the very, very first fight that I ever tracked a pick for was Ramiz Brahimaj versus Michael Gilmore. Brahimaj was favored to win, and I did take Brahimaj, and he did get that win. And I figured, and part of the reason I felt good about that was because Brahimaj is like, oh, this guy has only ever won by submission in his MMA career, and he's now facing somebody that only has submission losses in their MMA career. And I don't believe Gilmore fought again after that loss. That is correct. He has not competed in mixed martial arts since. He's now 37 years old, so he was, I think, 35, 34 when that fight took place. And his only other MMA win was against Sasha Palatnikov, who has got a 2-1 record outside of the UFC since losing to Brahimaj and getting cut, but went 1-2 during his UFC run, and his only win was a knockout over Louis Koski in 2020. After that, lost to Impa Kasanage by submission, then lost to Brahimaj, and has an 0-3 MMA record with submission. So Brahimaj's only recent success, since 2019, since getting into the UFC, including all of his layoffs, has been submitting guys that have no submission game. Mickey Gall has a 6-0 submission record, and all but one of his appearances have been in his MMA career have been against UFC. I hesitate to say UFC level competition because obviously CM Punk and Mike Jackson and Sage Northcutt are all in there. That being said, the guy has made all but one of his appearances in his MMA career in the UFC, and I think there is something to be said for that. Brahimaj has never won going the distance in his entire MMA career, and he has no knockouts. You can't say the same for Gall. I spoke earlier during the intro about how you generally want to take the more well-rounded side in a matchup where you're not quite sure where it's going to go. I've seen some people that think that Brahimaj's striking is further along than Gall's just because of the performance that he had against Max Griffin in his UFC debut 4 years ago. I believe Brahimaj is still at Fortis MMA, so he's still at a very high-level gym where he could be making improvements, but it's I think that people are more speculative on Brahimaj making improvements, and we didn't really get to see any of them against Garimbo, although Garimbo pressured him enough that he didn't really even give him the opportunity. You compare that to Gall, who made the switch to Killcliff FC in 2022 and has certainly improved based on what people were expecting him to put out against Bassil Hafez, and then actually giving a better account of himself than anybody expected. And then you look at the stats for these guys for both of their UFC careers. I expect Gall to be the better offensive striker in this matchup for the time that it stays upright. It's possible Brahimaj takes him down early, but Gall is primarily a grappler and has never been submitted, despite facing guys that are very capable, dangerous grapplers in themselves, such as Randy Brown. I don't expect Gall to suffer his first submission loss to this guy that has only submitted guys with O and X submission records in the UFC. I think Gall is a bit of a higher level than that. And I think even though these guys are both works in progress at best when it comes to striking, I still expect Gall to be a little bit further along in that department and to be more active in terms of volume and land the more effective shots. I think it's possible that Brahimaj gets the first round, but the guy's never won going the distance. Now, if you're looking for a person to get your first decision win over, you could hardly do worse than McGhee Gall, who only has one decision win in his own MMA career himself, and that was over Salim Tuari in August of 2019. But the guy until you actually get it done, it's easy to hold it against the person, particularly when it's one thing when a fighter hasn't gone the distance, period, but Brahimaj has gone to a decision 4 times and he's lost every time, and it's not like any of them have been splits. They've all been unanimous decision losses, and that was true even before he got to the UFC and fought Court McGhee and Themba Gorimbo last time out. I think Gall's going to get a 29-28 decision win. It's possible if Brahimaj gasses out really bad trying to put this fight on the ground that Gall even gets a late finish here. I don't know if it's going to be a submission. Brahimaj has a 10-0 submission record in his own right. He is 0-1 in terms of KO wins losses. So if Gall does get a finish, I think it's probably much more likely it's going to be a knockout, like late in the third. But I think similar to how I said 29-28 with Elliott conceding the first round against Bassil Hafez, I think this is going to be another case where Gall, if he doesn't get a 30-27, I think that he's probably going to take the last 10 minutes as the fresher, slightly more well-rounded fighter, and Brahimaj gets cut afterwards. So I do think Brahimaj's first round sub or bust in this spot. I'm kind of surprised it's aligned as competitively as it is, but given both guys are so kind of unreliable, I do understand why it was a pick'em for most of this week, but I'm glad that the market agrees with me in terms of gradually siding towards Gall. So give me McGhee Gall to win by unanimous decision. The next fight is Marcin Tybura and Jhonata Diniz. Tybura enters 25-9. Last fought in August 3 months ago at Fight Night Tybura versus Spivak 2, a rematch of a fight the two of them had in February of 2020. First time they fought, Spivak lost by unanimous decision. As one of the most improved fighters, I think, across the entire UFC roster over the last 4 years, Spivak proved as much when he got a first-round submission on Tybura during their rematch, despite the fact that I believe, if memory serves, Tybura was able to get a takedown, was at least had better position in the first part of the fight, but then I believe, was it an armbar that Spivak was able to get after he capitalized on a mistake? Yes, it was an armbar, so my memory was correct. Back in August. I believe that was the fight night I was referring to earlier that I skipped, where I wasn't super confident on, or just given that there were some other cancellations for that card too. I decided to stay off. But Spivak, I did do the minute to win it breakdowns for that week, even so, and my prediction that Spivak would win did come true, even though he was favored. So, it's not something to super brag about. What I was much more happy with was at Tuivasa Tybura earlier this year in Tybura's previous event, another fight night that I skipped. So I skipped the last two Marcin Tybura cards. I did have Tybura graded to win, but did not feel super confident picking him. So I decided instead, even though I went against my own rule, if you've got an underdog, you should just play the underdog. The thing was, I was willing to make an exception in that case because for some reason, the heavyweight under was available at plus odds against Tai Tuivasa. Yeah, I'm going to take that. And the fight ended in the first round. I know most people were hoping or expecting Tuivasa was going to be, if the under was going to materialize, it was going to be because Tuivasa just whomped Tybura. But I thought there was good odds for either guy to finish the other one, especially because I had Tybura graded to win. So I decided to go against my own rule and go with another plus money route. And it ended up paying off, even though that was just a pick because, again, I skipped that card for betting purposes due to, I think, a handful of other cancellations that happened around that event too. And the event prior to that, dude got whomped by Tom Aspinall. That was a case where I tried to be cheeky, and just because, I've got another rule where it's like, you can't stay off of the main event. You gotta have a main event bet or a read of some kind. Wasn't gonna play Aspinall off of all that ring rust at the extreme odds he was available at. So I decided, you know what? Even though all but one of Aspinall's UFC appearances have ended in the first round, I'm gonna say that he comes out tentative. A little bit more tentative or cautious than usual as he tries to ease himself back in, and then hopefully Tybura does enough to survive to the second half of the second round before getting finished late by Aspinall. And then Aspinall finished him inside of 90 seconds. So I did make profit at that UFC London event last year. That was part of that pretty ridiculous run I went on. But I had a bunch of underdog picks on that card, and I don't think I hit any of them at all. And in fact, I had McParkin graded to beat Jamal Pogues, but I actually skipped betting that one. And I remember thinking, wow, the one underdog, I could have at least gone 1 for 6, I think, on underdogs today, but regrettably did not play the one underdog that would have hit out of the bunch. But the 3 other picks that I was confident on for that card ended up hitting. So all that's to say, I've had an interesting recent history with Marcin Tybura cards. And I did at the event prior to that. I think I made him a leg against Blagoy Ivanov just because I was always willing to fade Ivanov. But I also played Romanov as like minus 300 at UFC 278 in a fight that really should have gone down as a draw. It's unfortunate for Romanov's sake, who, by the way, free Romanov. It's ridiculous that my boy has been released from the roster and hasn't been immediately re-signed. 13th best heavyweight in the world. What are we doing? World-class athlete. It's ridiculous that fight wasn't a draw. And I have to wonder how much differently it would have gone, too, if that hadn't been at elevation and if Romanov had just a little bit more of gas and was in a little bit of better shape. But it is what it is. Anyway, conversely, Jhonata Diniz last appeared at the same fight night event, Tybura versus Spivak 2. And his fight with Carl Williams was actually part of the reason that I kind of skipped this event, because even though I wanted to believe that Carl Williams was going to effectively wrestle his way to victory, he did not. He didn't opt to wrestle until the final round, and only 2 of the judges ended up giving him the final round. And if he had been more fervent about shooting takedowns in the first 10 minutes, it's possible that he would have still gotten the win and might still even be on the UFC roster. There's a lot of people that are speculating that the UFC has been telling guys in the back or behind the scenes or whatever that they need to stop going with these wrestle-heavy game plans or they risk getting caught. That obviously didn't deter Romanov from doing it against Nascimento. It did seem like if that is what's happening, it did somewhat deter Williams here against Jhonata Diniz, and Diniz was able to capitalize on it enough to get a pretty dominant unanimous decision win that at least one judge saw as a 30-27. Prior to that, Diniz had somewhat of a letdown performance against Austin Lane at Fight Night Nickal Perez earlier this year. that was a disastrous event for me. I think I very nearly got reverse swept, and I got kind of bailed out taking the under 1.5 rounds against Lane, or in the Lane Diniz fight, because Lane just laid and preyed on him for the first round of that fight. That result was part of the reason why I tried to advocate for people to avoid picking Despain against Austin Lane, even though most people weren't really giving Lane any chance and assuming he wasn't going to have the cardio to fight that way for 3 rounds. Turns out he did, at least to get a 29-28, have it 1-1 going into the third, and then fight the more well-rounded fight down the stretch against Despain, who proved that the Waldo Cortez Acosta fight was no fluke. The guy just really did not have any idea how to get up off of his back. Diniz, his takedown defense kind of magically rebounded in the second round of the Lane fight, and he was able to more effectively keep the fight upright. And then as Lane kind of got tired from shooting and not finding success, Diniz was able to knock him down and thankfully save my heavyweight under that was heavily juiced that ended up salvaging that event otherwise for me from a picks perspective. Now, this fight was a pick'em, I think, for most of this week, but as I'm recording this, Tybura has kind of ballooned out to a more considerable favorite. He's now out to like minus 145. When the line initially came out, Tybura was actually the underdog at plus 150, and that was a handful of days ago because this is a short notice replacement. Diniz was obviously supposed to fight at UFC Edmonton against Derek Lewis in the featured fight on the main card preceding the co-main event. Lewis, for balls was hot or whatever other reason, decided he wasn't really feeling Canada and pulled out after weigh-ins. So it was, I'm sure there's a lot of people that specifically bought a ticket to see Derek Lewis that were left feeling really disappointed by that last-minute cancellation. Diniz, though, was, after all that prep and being fully ready to go, got a rebooking against Tybura, who did not have another opponent lined up prior to taking this, which is why I'm so surprised that so many people are optimistic about the odds of him doing well here. Especially because Diniz was favored to beat Derek Lewis, and I would have been very skeptical of that, even though I picked Diniz to win, just because my analysis, for a lot of reasons, just doesn't like Derek Lewis at all. It's going to be hard to pick Derek Lewis in basically any fight going forward unless he's fighting an absolute total can, which we're not quite at that stage yet. But it's just interesting to me that there's so many people that think Tybura, who just turned 39 on, I believe it was Sunday, this past Sunday, that this guy is going to be able to more effectively wrestle Jhonata Diniz than guys like Austin Lane or Carl Williams, who are presumably better athletes than Tybura is at this stage of his career. I'm just kind of surprised that things have shook out the way that they have, especially given Tybura is somebody that's been knocked out multiple times during his UFC run. And arguably the most brutal of all of those knockouts took place within the last year and a half, within his last 3 appearances against Tom Aspinall. So I think it is fair to wonder what stage the guy's chin is at 39 years old. He's coming off of a loss where he just got finished. I think that he's absolutely a candidate for being a front runner in this spot. It's not like he was preparing for another opponent or whatever. He just took this on short notice and is probably getting a decent amount of money to do it. But Diniz is a guy that hasn't lost yet, has shown vulnerability in his game, but I also think has pretty clearly demonstrated at this point that he's going to be a more sophisticated striker than what Tybura is going to be able to offer. And his takedown defense, what really impressed me was the Lane fight, as I referred to earlier, where it seemed like his takedown defense just kind of magically got better in the middle of the fight to where it was able to completely turn it around for him. I could very easily see something like that happening here too, where Tybura recognizes the danger early in this fight, shows no hesitation towards trying to put the fight on the ground early, is able to keep Diniz down on the ground for the first part of it, but doesn't really get anywhere close to finishing him. They come out of the corner in the second round. Diniz is more prepared for the just kind of the rhythm and is able to be more anticipatory of the takedowns, having already experienced it in the previous round, is able to keep the fight upright. And then as long as this fight is standing, it really is Diniz's fight to lose. So, when this was a pick'em, I already felt good about taking Diniz as the younger underdog in this spot that was coming in more prepared, given the cancellation against Derek Lewis than what Tybura is taking, or than what Tybura has had taking this on short notice. Now I feel I'm totally I shouldn't say all in, but I'm totally down with taking Diniz at like definitive plus money now, as the market has gradually assumed that this guy that's 39 years old is going to be able to wrestle Diniz for 15 minutes. Wrestling is the most exhausting way of fighting in MMA, and you're counting on a 39-year-old heavyweight to do that against a guy that's undefeated and 6 years younger than him and much more capable as a striker with a very, very lethal knockout threat. This is a guy that won all of his fights by knockout prior to his last appearance, which was the first decision win of his career, which it's not like he gassed out in the last round against Carl Williams. Williams just finally got him down and was able to fight Williams' most effective method of fighting. So Diniz, I think a lot of the people that were wondering what is his cardio going to be like once he actually has to get into the third round, it's not like he gave a bad account of himself. One of the judges still ended up giving the third round to Diniz despite the fact that he got taken down. So I really do think that this is a good spot for Diniz, especially at plus money now. I don't really get why so many people are optimistic that Tybura at 39 years old is going to be able to fight a ground-heavy, control-heavy game plan for 15 minutes. I think Diniz is probably going to get a knockout in... I wanna say the first round. I want to believe that he just starches this guy, but I will say that we see something similar to what happened with Austin Lane, as I alluded to earlier, where Tybura is able to give him the best version of himself in the first round, probably even win the first round just with, control, and Diniz just kind of not trying to tire himself out, attempting to get up, just kind of when he's already recognized that he's been taken down, just saying, okay, I'm cool with just preventing myself from getting finished down here. Let me come out and try again in the second round more fresh. I'll be ready for whatever attempts are coming. I don't let the fight get on the ground. And then when Tybura is forced to exchange on my terms, that is when I go in for the kill. So give me Diniz to win by second round knockout here as I believe my first underdog pick of the evening. That is correct. The next fight is Damon Jackson and Jim Miller. Jackson enters 23-7-1, coming off of a total dismantling at the hands of Stipe Miocic back at Fight Night Tybura versus Spivak 2. I did a minute to win a breakdown for that fight, and the feedback, look, it's been pretty good in terms of doing those breakdowns, but I have thought it was kind of interesting that, like, the kind of responses that you get from putting your picks out on YouTube versus how I've been almost exclusively putting them out prior to this year on Twitter is interesting, just because I made a minute to win it thing about why I thought Jackson was going to win, and that was probably the most negatively received minute to win it breakdown I've done out of all of them. I don't know if it's because of Miocic fans or the fact that it was just an underdog pick that didn't go well. Most people, I think, don't really respect the mentality that not respect, but at least adhere to the mentality that I do. The plus money is plus money, and if the pick doesn't work out, it's easy to just write off long term and get on to the next one. So when Jackson lost as badly as he did, there were a lot of people that were like, "Oh, what a terrible pick," and it's like, all right, whatever. I've generally recognized that my analysis has more favorably looked upon Jackson than it probably should, which is reflected in the fact that I took him as an underdog against Alexander Hernandez. He won a split decision that could have gone either way. I believe I picked him over Billy Quarantillo. I'm pretty sure I took Dan Ige over him, but I can't quite remember. That might have been a stay away. That was at the first event of last year at Strickland Naimavov, so it's been a while. I did take Pat Sabatini as like a 300 favorite over Damon Jackson, and that's arguably the most impressive win he's had in the UFC, which was the head kick KO that he got inside of 90 seconds the same week that I believe his brother passed away. So it was an emotional performance for him. And then I believe Dan Argueto was debuting up a weight class when he fought Damon Jackson, so I wouldn't have put out a pick for that fight. But I've generally, outside of that Sabatini result, have sided with Damon Jackson in pretty much every fight that he's had within the last 2 years, I believe. Similar story with Jim Miller, who enters 37-18. Took a lot of damage in his fight with King Green at UFC 300, where I did pick Jim Miller as an underdog. Interesting scorecards for that one, not because they were incorrect, but just actually because they were very accurate. One of the very rare, I believe it was 29-26. You don't see that one often, where, normally if there's like, 10-8s, it's going to be a 30-26. One of the rare cases here where you've got a fighter that wins the first round and then concedes multiple 10-8s on the back end, which is exactly what Jim Miller did. A lot of people were surprised that Green wasn't able to finish Miller in what was, I think, one of the first couple, if not 3 fights that were on the card that day, certainly on the prelims. But Miller at least did win the first round, and that was part of the reason I felt good picking him as an underdog, because he had shown in recent appearances that, despite the fact that it hadn't really been there for a lot of his other UFC career, he had still kind of somehow fallen into this one-punch power that, given the recent results and knockouts that Green had suffered, I thought Miller might be able to capitalize on that trend himself. Did do enough damage to win the first round in the eyes of, I think, all the judges in that fight, but as has often been the case with Miller in his career, just kind of faded down the stretch, and or not even down the stretch, over the last 10 minutes. Took way too much damage from a more sophisticated striker in Green, and lost a pretty resounding result, and somehow avoided getting finished. He's not fighting as much of a significant or sophisticated, proven striker in this spot against Jackson. When I found out that this fight was happening, and then I looked at the odds, there's sometimes where, and again, this is an underdog bet, so if it doesn't play out the way that I think it is, it's easy for me to just, look past it and move on. But one of the things that I heard when I first started getting into doing this, and this came from, this was the mentality of someone that I really respected that was doing written content, has still been putting out bets on Bet MMA tips, but has totally dropped off his newsletter, or maybe he's made it exclusively private at this point. Not quite sure. But Pig Lord MMA used to speak on how you really should trust your instinct as a capper. If you look at a line, you shouldn't be trying to draw water out of a stone. If you look at a line and it just hits you immediately as, this doesn't make any sense, that's a bet you should make. in terms of if you're valuing the other side, in terms of this doesn't make sense, this should be way wider, or this doesn't make sense, this line should be flipped. I was stunned based on the two recent performances that these guys had against their respective levels of competition, that Jim Miller was the underdog here, and that he's become a little bit more of an underdog since I even put him out as a plus 130 pick earlier this week. As much damage as you want to say that Miller took in his fight with King Green, there's no way that you can argue that Jackson did not take as much damage against Stipe Mariscal, if not worse. Jackson got manhandled absolutely everywhere. It was bad. It was not a good performance. I thought that he would have a much better showing, particularly given Mariscal missed weight and looked horrendous on the scales. And now you're in a situation where Jackson, who's being given the cardio advantage in this fight, and understandably so, despite the fact that he's got less than he's got less than a third of the experience going the distance in his MMA career that Jim Miller does. He does have more success when he has gone the distance. But Jackson's moving up to lightweight now, which he only has one previous UFC appearance at. And that was his debut during his first stint in 2014 when he got submitted by Yancy Medeiros. So he's fought earlier in his career at lightweight. I think in between his UFC stints, he made a few more lightweight appearances, but nothing during his second run in the UFC. Almost all of his success at the highest level of MMA has been at featherweight. So he's now moving up a weight class, adding 10 more pounds onto what he's going to be carrying going into this fight, and you wonder if that's going to affect his cardio at all. I still think that he probably should have the cardio advantage here over Jim Miller, but the thing is, this is a guy in Jackson who has been knocked out 4 times during his MMA career, which is, I believe, twice as often as Jim Miller has been knocked out. Miller has only suffered 2 knockouts his entire MMA career. One was to Dan Hooker in 2018. The other was to Cowboy Cerrone in 2014, a loss that he avenged a few years ago. It just shocks me that given the difference in like chin and striking power, because again, Jackson, he had the knockout over Sabatini, but that was a head kick. And I believe he had another knockout in the fight before he fought in PFL in 2018. Those were 2 of his 4 knockouts in his entire MMA career. The other 2 that happened were both before his first UFC run in 2014. So this is not a guy that's been a proven powerful striker on the feet. That's why the Sabatini result shocked so many people, was because he wasn't even a guy that was known for having lethal kicks or whatever. That result, I think, is what in a lot of ways accelerated the chinny allegations for Sabatini himself. But I don't expect Jackson to be able to hurt Miller on the feet in the same way that Green did. Conversely, I don't see why Miller wouldn't be able to hurt Jackson early, given the power that he's shown very, very recently, and the fact that we've seen Jackson get knocked out badly as recently as 4 fights ago against Dan Ige, and also got flatlined against Elliott during his second fight back in the UFC for his second run. So I think you got to be much more concerned about Jackson's ability to tolerate damage, particularly off of his last performance, where a lot of people were saying they didn't understand why the ref didn't stop the fight against Stipe Mariscal, than you do for Jim Miller, who more people were just wondering how did Green not finish it, as opposed to why didn't the ref stop it, even though it was pretty clearly a pair of 10-8s for Jim Miller down the stretch. But it was a similar story with Damon Jackson down the stretch against Stipe Mariscal. So these are 2 guys coming off performances where they took a lot of damage, and one side is the much more powerful striker than the other one is. One's got the cardio advantage of the other. I'm going to give Jackson the benefit of saying that he probably survives this going the distance. And therefore, I think he's probably going to get the final round over Jim Miller. But I fully expect Miller to have the upper hand in the early stage of this fight to where he wins the first round pretty convincingly. At that point, this comes down to who wins the second round. And it could go either way. It's just going to come down to how much does Miller have left in the tank relative to how much damage does Jackson take in the first round, and what is his ability to recover like. He didn't recover well during the Mariscal fight. I don't necessarily think he's going to recover well here, but I think he's going to survive long enough to where Miller doesn't, Miller recognizes that he's banked the first 2 rounds, that he's not overexerting himself trying to get the finish. He's just trying to get out of there with a decision win when the third round happens. So I'm going to say Miller wins a close decision here in what is a potential fight of the night contender. And that, if there is finishing upside here, I think it's definitely got to be on Miller. It's possible he gets a first round knockout, but I don't totally expect that. I think it's more realistic to think that this fight between, you hesitate to call Jackson an old guy because he's 36, but he is in clearly the decline stage of his career. Miller's obviously 41. The guy is a tried and true tested veteran at this point. And most people say they can't imagine a world in which Miller retires in this spot, win or lose. So he's out there to go and win this. And I'm frankly surprised that he's not favored to do so, given what he's demonstrated lately against what Jackson has demonstrated and shown vulnerability to, now moving up into a new weight class. I think this is a great matchup for Miller. I'm surprised he's the underdog here. I'm happy to play him at plus odds. So give me Jim Miller by close, unanimous decision. I think this fight comes down to who wins the second round. I won't necessarily be surprised if Jackson wins the final 10 minutes, but I also won't be surprised if Miller finds a knockout in those first 10 minutes either. The next fight is Eryk Anders and Chris Weidman. Anders enters 16-8. Is it Anders or Anders? I don't know. I always say Anders because of workaholics. Anyway, Anders enters 16-8. Last appeared in March earlier this year in what was, I believe, Jamie Pickett's final UFC appearance. I believe he retired after this fight. That was in the middle of a 5-fight losing streak. Anders, I think, was a pretty heavy favorite in that one. Prior to that, last competed a little under a year prior at UFC 289, losing a unanimous decision to Marc-Andre Barriault. I believe I picked Anders as an underdog in that bout. Prior to that was at Fight Night Thompson-Holland, which was, I think it was Orlando. It was some Fight Night event in Florida where he knocked out Kyle Dawkins in the second round. I think I took the over in that one, which I believe I took several overs that were juiced at that event that did not end up hitting in that event. Made me reevaluate my the frequency with which I would attempt to hedge on rounds, particularly at plus odds, which is funny because the fight prior to that, I took the over on his fight with Junyoung Park, thinking it was going to be close, and it went to split decision, and I felt pretty vindicated for making that call. So I've had an interesting bit of history betting Anders, but I've typically been on his side, although I don't believe that I can't remember if I had him graded to beat Kyle Dawkins or not. I don't recall what the line was for that one. But I would have been hesitant to pick him just because he was a bit of a plotter. Wow, it's crazy looking back at that fight because he was a plus 200 underdog to Kyle Dawkins. And then they competed at a grappling. I didn't know this. They competed at a grappling event after UFC 289 last year. So at the end of last year in December, and he was a plus 300 underdog to Kyle Daukaus at Fury Pro Grappling 8, and he beat Daukaus again. That's pretty crazy. Looks like he's been competing at a handful of grappling events recently. Looks like he lost to Joe Pyfer in 2022, then fought Daukaus at that a year later. And it looks like in a pick'em with a fighter named Luke Fernandez, he lost at Fury Pro Grappling 10. So that's interesting. Conversely, Weidman hasn't fought since Fight Night Blanchfield-Fioro earlier this year, an event that was highly controversial for several officiating blunders. Probably there's usually a lot of critiquing about the judging lately, or not lately. I mean, there just normally is with the current state of MMA. Reffing, there's usually not entire events that get sabotaged by bad reffing. It's usually just like one fight on a card where like a ref commits a blunder or something. Good example of that was UFC 307, I believe it was, when Cesar Almeida fought Ihor Potieria, and the ref just kept removing Potieria from the fence whenever he would get some kind of clinch with Almeida, or I can't remember if Almeida was clinching him, but in any event, the separations were almost instantaneous, and it was like the ref was like officiating a boxing event or something. It was pretty ridiculous. But you typically don't see entire cards sabotaged by bad reffing the way that Blanchfield-Fioro was in several different fights. Cedric Dumas versus Nursultan Ruzaboyev comes to mind in terms of a fight that probably should have gone down as a no contest due to a missed eye poke. Another example was the stoppage that most people felt was premature, despite being pretty compromised. Bill Aljo versus Kyle Nelson. But of all the fights that were compromised by the bad judging at that, or the bad reffing at that fight night, the most predominant example, which somehow doesn't really get talked about, was Chris Weidman versus Bruno Silva, a fight in which Weidman committed 3 different eye pokes and was awarded a technical decision win instead of losing a point at any point in the fight for committing multiple of those infractions, and then ultimately having the fight ended in favorable terms for him, despite the fact that he committed 3 different fouls, none of which got penalized. But because people are fans of Chris Weidman, because he's a former UFC champion, most people were just willing to look the other way. You saw a lot of people that bet Weidman as an underdog that were they felt pretty vindicated just because Weidman was kind of winning the fight anyway. But it was another unfortunate example, and one that gets overlooked pretty often in terms of fouls not being correctly enforced in MMA in this day and age. I think you can probably count on 2 hands how many times this year a point's actually been deducted across all of the UFC fights that have taken place, which is pretty disappointing relative to how the rules are supposed to be enforced. So Weidman did get that win. He looked pretty good, but part of the reason that I took Ismail Narudiev at UFC 308 over Bruno Silva was because of how bad Bruno Silva looked in his fight against Weidman. And it came out after the Narudiev fight that Silva was talking about how he's been kind of dealing with this anxiety thing where he gets to the point where if he can feel a fight slipping away, then he just kind of totally mentally collapses and he doesn't even want to be in the cage anymore. Now, that's great if you bet Narudiev or if you bet Weidman in the last case. But in terms of evaluating how good those guys are going to be going forward, how much can you really take away from those Silva performances in terms of evaluating the effectiveness they have left? Remains to be seen what that means for Narudiev. But in the case of Weidman, it's concerning because the only appearance that he's had in the last 3 years since the spectacular, tragically poetic leg fracture that he suffered against Uriah Hall was a fight against Brad Tavares in which he got 30-27 and Tavares was largely just able to throw almost 2/3 of the significant strikes, I think, that Tavares landed on Weidman in that fight were just low leg kicks. So Weidman came back from several years off and looked terrible. Now he's in this spot where it kind of feels, even though he's an underdog, and now the line is actually narrowed to the point of being a pick'em, it kind of feels like the UFC is trying to set him up for a win here. But he's talked about how, and this is generally a red flag for fighters in terms of delusions of grandeur, Weidman is very much still in the position where he thinks that if he can string a few wins together, he might become a potential contender at middleweight again, despite the fact that he's 40 years old. That's wishful thinking, to say the least. So even though the UFC is giving him a fight in his, I believe his home state is New York, so he's almost certainly going to have the crowd on his side in this case. Anders is an Alabama native, if memory serves correct. But you would think the crowd's going to be on Weidman's side, irrespective of the fact that he's, former UFC champion. You would think that the UFC is trying to give him a favorable opponent here, just because Anders, even though he has somewhat of a rep as a hard hitter, really is not that much of an acclaimed knockout artist in the UFC. He does have 9 knockout wins on his record, but the majority of those came before he actually got to the UFC. His UFC debut was a knockout over Rafael Natal, and he also knocked out Tim Williams in the final 30 seconds of their fight in 2018. But his only other recent knockout wins, one was Kyle Daukaus, who we know the Daukaus brothers both are pretty notorious for their chins at this point, and Vinicius Moreira, Vinicius Moreira, who had a 1-4 MMA knockout record, and I believe Anders was the last person to knock him out of those 4. So, he had been facing guys that had been, at least recently, pretty notorious for getting knocked out and, suffered as much accordingly. Wasn't able to take advantage of Marc-Andre Barriault's chin when he fought him last year as a pretty healthy underdog. And Barriault, we just saw him get knocked out in the first round by Dustin Stoltzfus, a guy who, that was only the second knockout win of Stoltzfus's MMA career, and it came during a time where the gloves are ruining the sport, supposedly, because it's too hard to get knockouts. So Anders hasn't demonstrated the consistent one-punch power to where you would think he'd be able to take advantage of Weidman's chin. I think the UFC recognized that in terms of making this matchup for Weidman, who is an employee of theirs, not just as a fighter, but also not necessarily a commentator, but a kind of a studio analyst of sorts. He's been doing a lot of their pay-per-view, I think they're weigh-in shows for the pay-per-views. Remains to be seen if he's going to be showing up for this upcoming pay-per-view. My guess would be he wouldn't be, because he's actually got to weigh in himself and then go through fight prep and whatnot. But I do think that this feels like the UFC is trying to give Weidman another win here, if not necessarily give him a send-off. And Anders has kind of psyched himself out of enough fights to where I think that even if, he has moments of more effectiveness in this fight, it's just going to be at the point where, I listened to the Sherdog radio breakdown of this card, and I thought it was funny that the way that Ben Duffy framed it, where he said, I think the way this is going to go is I'm going to have Anders winning 29-28. But it's going to be a split decision in Chris Weidman's favor, and at least one of the scorecards is going to have it 30-27 for Weidman, just because the judging is going to be that firmly slanted in his favor. And I can understand why they would think that's going to be the case. So I do think this probably goes the distance. In terms of finishing upside, my guess would be that most of it is on the side of Anders. I don't expect Weidman to get a finish here, but I also think it's worth noting, too, in the case where it does go the distance, the only decision win Weidman, or the only loss by decision Weidman has in his whole career was the Tavares letdown performance that was off of several years of ring rust and injury, so that is worth considering here. He is going to have a reach advantage. In terms of volume, I think that both guys are kind of, basically the same at this point. I don't really want to see Weidman try to wrestle just because I think that's probably going to tire him out at his age, and Anders has pretty more than solid takedown defense for his UFC career. I do think Weidman probably has the submission upside, but Anders is somebody that only has one submission loss on his MMA record. And that was against Andre Muniz, who's a pretty well-acclaimed grappler that came 3 years ago. So I don't necessarily expect Weidman to give him another submission loss, but if one guy is going to get a submission, it probably is going to be Weidman. So you can add that as another feather in the cap at that point. I just don't expect that it's going to come down to that. So I'm going to say that Weidman gets a 29-28 split decision win here. I do think it's going to be a close fight. He is starting to narrow narrowing into the pick'em range. I'm not going to feel good. I wouldn't bet him as a favorite. I'll say that. So if this line does finally, reach total flipping point, I'd probably just stay away from betting him. In that case, I'll probably put Weidman in the moonshot because I've already put the pick out at plus odds and just stay away from it entirely. I am super, super, super concerned about his damage tolerance at this point. And Anders, even though so the big reason that I actually had him graded to win against Bruno Silva, but I just didn't feel good about betting that because Silva has proven to be a much more consistent finisher in terms of winning his own fights that he's favored in than Anders has been. So Anders hasn't proven to be as much of a power threat as Silva, which is why I feel better about playing Weidman as an underdog here, because I think it's more realistic that Weidman's going to be able to survive through than I did when he was fighting Bruno Silva. That didn't end up being the case, but we didn't know the kind of state of mind Silva was in at the time that he's recently revealed to be. That being said, with Weidman's history of damage and injuries, if this does end up going into a total line flip, there's no way I'd feel comfortable playing him as a favorite, and I would probably just stay away at that point. So get him while you can at plus odds if you really do want to bet this fight. Otherwise, I would just stay away from it. But give me Chris Weidman to win by greasy split. The next fight is Marcus McGhee and Jonathan Martinez. Real quick, as you can see, it's now daytime. I had to take a break from talking about these fights. And there's a construction project happening outside of my apartment. There's been a pile driver going during business hours the last 2 weeks, which is why I'm now wearing ear pods to cancel out the noise. AirPods. I already tested the sound, and thankfully it's not getting picked up, so you don't have to worry about that. But just wanted to clarify why the sudden change in backdrop. Anyway, McGhee is 9-1. Last fought in January of this year, taking down Gaston Bolaños, who I spoke about in the intro of this card. He won by knockout. That performance from Bolaños was a big part of the reason I Thought about fading him last week against Ramiz. Prior to that, McGhee knocked out JP Buys. I played the under for that one as a parlay leg, I believe, at Fight Night Luque Dos Anjos last year, and McGhee knocked him out in under 2.5 minutes. In his UFC debut in April of last year, he also submitted Journey Newson in the second round. McGhee's had one fight in his MMA career go into the third round, and that was barely 30 seconds of the third round. So this is a guy that in 10 appearances at 34 years old has never gone the distance once, which is interesting. But we haven't seen anything that would indicate that his cardio isn't great. And the guy also, I believe, has more... he's got more second-round finishes than first-round finishes on his resume, I believe. Yes, he's got 5. So I think that's something that's worth noting here in terms of trying to evaluate this guy's cardio. It's, the fact that it's harder to get finishes out of the first round than it is in the first round. So that's something to his credit. Jonathan Martinez enters 19-5, last loss to Jose Aldo at UFC 301 this year in May. Kind of had a bit of a starstruck look about him. Really was not throwing at the volume we're accustomed to seeing him do. He was fighting Aldo he was fighting the King of Rio in Rio. Despite the fact that Aldo was coming back from, I think, multiple years of ring rust at that point. Aldo really kind of shook him a little bit. And it was a step up in competition for him. His best win, obviously, is the Said Nurmagomedov decision, but there's several people that would tell you that fight should have been scored for Nurmagomedov and that it shouldn't have been a unanimous decision. It should have at least been a split. I'm inclined to agree, even though I picked Martinez, and I've actually picked Martinez in every fight that he's appeared in since 2022. He was at that Fight Night Makhachev Green, the first event that I ever did, that I spoke about a bit earlier in this show relative to Ramiz Brahimaj. That day he fought Alejandro Perez, and I think it is important in terms of evaluating the rise that Martinez has had because, I mentioned during the 301 card, he's one of my favorite fighters I've evaluated since I started doing this. So watching him go on that win streak felt great. As someone that had put a lot of stock into saying that this guy is good and could potentially be a top 10 name in this very, very stacked bantamweight division. Although, people like to say, oh, fraud check. I don't think it was a fraud check. I just think Jose Aldo is one of the best MMA fighters ever. So even at his age, there are people... he's an anomaly. So, the guy was able to buck the age trend in that case and battle back against Jonathan Martinez and win. I wasn't quite sure which way I was gonna go when I saw this fight was announced, because I know that sometimes I can be a victim of going or backing fighters that have impressive numbers, but in a small sample size. In this case, McGhee has 3 fights, and none of them have lasted longer than 9 minutes. You compare that to Martinez, who's somebody that I've really liked before, but is coming off a loss. It's like, which way am I going to go here? The numbers are telling me that McGhee probably should win, and I think that's making sense just because, going further than the numbers actually, you look at the recent results between these guys. McGhee's got the much more evident power in his hands, and Martinez is somebody that, even though he's only got 1 knockout loss on his resume, it was somebody that, like, Davey Grant is a guy that hits pretty hard and was able to put him out pretty bad. And if you look at the other names on the resume of Martinez in terms of the way that he built himself up to getting that co-main event at UFC 301, it's really, there's been a lot of can crushing. I think more than most people, maybe even including myself, want to admit. Zviad Lazishvili, who started that winning streak for him, had no other UFC appearances after losing to Martinez and has not fought in MMA since. Alejandro Perez, I believe, retired after that loss to Jonathan Martinez. That is correct. He has not fought since losing that fight to Martinez. And Perez had a pretty good UFC run overall. Like, I'm not going to crib it. He clearly had a winning record. I'm not going to crib it together off the top right now looking at it. But he did lose 3 of his last 4 fights, and the last one was to Martinez. So the guy had, at that point, clearly fallen off. And I believe I think he was 33 at the time that he fought, so not quite in the decline of his career, but there had been a fall off. Even enough to the point that I felt comfortable picking Martinez, the first event that I ever graded. Vince Morales, was out of the UFC, I believe, after he lost to Martinez. Obviously, finally came back this year. I think was a short notice replacement for Taylor Lapilus at UFC Paris this year, but did not have a great showing. I'm not sure if he got any of the rounds, but my guess is, being that it was UFC Paris, it was probably a 30-27 in Lapilus's favor. And yeah, I'm trying to bring that up right now. But while I do that, Cub Swanson is 41 now and was 39 when those guys fought earlier this year. So I wouldn't put much stock into that either. Yeah, Vince Morales lost 30-27 to Lapilus. So I know he took that on short notice flying around the world, but still was not an impressive showing. The Said Nurmagomedov fight, it's like I said, really could have gone either way. Adrian Yanez, I think Yanez is someone that's been a little bit overestimated by a lot of people. I was at UFC 287 when he was a big favorite over Rob Font, and I took Rob Font as an underdog, and that was the first time that he had been knocked out in his MMA career, and it happened in less than 3 minutes. And prior to that, I mean, the names that he had beaten, I don't even think there's really anyone super impressive on here other than maybe Davey Grant, and that fight was a split decision. And then after that fought Jonathan Martinez, and Martinez was able to just totally leg kick him out and was never really putting himself in any danger in terms of boxing exchanges that Yanez would have presumably been able to capitalize on. Bounced back with a good win over Vinicius Salvador, and I'm pretty sure he's got a fight coming up. Yeah, Daniel Marcos, that's going to be at Tampa, so that's going to be an interesting one. My guess is I'd probably pick Daniel Marcos, just because I have looked very favorably upon him in the past for several of his spots. But anyway, getting back to this fight, it's like I said, just running through that whole list of Martinez's rise. I felt good about betting him against a lot of these other fighters that he's faced, even including Jose Aldo. But I didn't feel good enough about Martinez against Aldo to make him a parlay leg like for the lower level plays. I just put him in the moonshot. So that was one of the reasons why I was able to have as good of an event as I did at UFC 301, was because I recognized the risk in him getting that step up in competition. This is a step up in competition for McGhee too. But at the same time, it's not like Martinez has faced a wealth of super elite competition. And the other thing about this fight that concerns me, that makes me feel very good about picking McGhee, is that there seems to be, based on what I've seen other people speak on, I look, people have a lot of different opinions about various different gyms. Since I started doing this, I've looked very, very favorably upon Factory X Muay Thai. And one of the reasons I looked so favorably upon them was because of the rise of a fighter like Jonathan Martinez. And from what I understand, Martinez has left Factory X after the Jose Aldo fight and is now the head coach of his own gym. So he's not getting any at 30 years old, he's not getting any tutelage from veterans or having exposure to other fighters on the UFC roster. He's, not necessarily his own training partner, but he's the best of what's available at the gym that he's at now. So you can definitively say that his preparation has fallen off from what he was getting before. And that does not make me optimistic against somebody like McGhee, who's at MMA Lab. And I know MMA Lab hasn't had a great year overall. O'Malley lost the belt. Kyler Phillips just had a massive letdown performance against Rob Font. Jared Cannonier has lost both of his fights this year. So I know a lot of the high-level talent at MMA Lab has not had a great year thus far. But McGhee is still a guy, especially at the bantamweight class, that is getting reps with guys like Phillips and O'Malley. Even just those two names by themselves, that's higher level training competition than what Martinez is presumably getting now, training out of his own gym at his home at Texas. So I think McGhee's going to come into this fight more prepared. It's possible that Martinez gives McGhee a look that he just really hasn't had to deal with, and that Martinez looks much more busy and active and less starstruck than he did against Aldo. But at the same time, so much of Martinez's success is prided on leg kicks that I feel like if McGhee is able to overcome that in the early going, he's going to be able to land the more effective and damaging shots, and Martinez is not going to be equipped to deal with that, especially given he really hasn't faced a hard hitter outside of their declining years coming up during this UFC run. I mean, Said Nurmagomedov is not really a power puncher. He's more of just a spinning kicks guy. Yanez hits hard, but again, I feel like people have kind of overestimated what his ceiling is in terms of this division. All those 37, 38, 39 at this point, late 30s. Swanson was 39 when they fought. The hardest hitter that he's faced during his UFC run, from what I can tell, is Davy Grant, and Davy Grant put him out cold, like bad. So I think Marcus McGhee's probably going to do something similar here. And I'll say it happens in the second round. It's possible Martinez has some success early with the leg kicks, maybe even gets one, a round from one of the judges. It's a close first round. Maybe it goes either way. But as McGhee settles in, as he has in, most of his other MMA appearances, my guess is he's eventually going to find that shot that puts Martinez out for good. And the difference in the prep, I think, is going to make itself apparent here. So I put McGhee out at minus 151. The line's starting to slim up a little bit. And I think it's because people are saying that this is, a big step up in competition for Marcus McGhee. And I don't dispute that. But given, again, the names that Martinez built himself up on to get to this point, I don't think it's as massive of a step up as people are making it out to be, to where this line should be slimming the way that it is. So I do feel good about Marcus McGhee here. I won't be surprised if Martinez wins going the distance, just because Marcus McGhee's never had to do that, so he doesn't have a lot of three-round fight experience, where if he's forced to manage that kind of load, if it is 1-1 going into the third, it's possible Martinez, with that little bit more of experience, is able to power himself through to the finish. But I still feel like McGhee's power threat is credible enough at this point that he's going to be able to capitalize on a guy in Martinez that's been knocked out before. So, and the last thing is McGhee has been finished himself, but only by submission, and Martinez has not had any submission wins in the UFC. He's never been submitted himself, but has no submission wins in the UFC. Hasn't won by submission since his last fight before joining the UFC in 2017, and is only attempting 0.1 submissions per 15 minutes. So I wouldn't even know, going back across his UFC experience, which fight he would have attempted the submission in. So I give me Marcus McGhee here to win by second round knockout, but I think it's possible he could win his first decision of his MMA career here too. Although if this does go the distance, I think it's more likely that Martinez is able to get the win. The main card opener at UFC 309 is Mauricio Ruffy and Hafez Llontop. I know many of you have been looking forward to me elaborating on this one, given the way that I'm leaning. Ruffy enters 10-1, last appeared at UFC 301 against Jamie Mullarkey and put him out in the final 30 seconds of the first round. Prior to that, appeared on Contender Series during the penultimate week of the previous season last year, where he got an upset win over Islam Makhachev's training partner, Raymond Magomedaliev. Magomedaliev, believe, won the first round, but then gassed out pretty bad, and Ruffy was just kind of doing whatever he wanted for the last 10 minutes. So even though Ruffy has never gone the distance technically, he was well on his way to winning a decision on Contender Series, but was able to do enough damage on the ground in the final stages to put Magomedaliev away and earn a contract. So I don't hold the fact that he hasn't gone the distance against his cardio, because although that was his only fight to that point that had gone 3 rounds, he clearly was going to win that one based on the fact that he had the better cardio than his opponent. So credit to him for that. Conversely, Hafez Llontop is 14-4, has not won since his own Contender Series appearance last year, which happened during the 6th week of the previous season. I believe, had a different opponent lined up for what would have been his UFC debut in April of this year. Chris Padilla filled in as a last-minute replacement, and Llontop unfortunately showed that he really just doesn't have much of a ground game to speak of, and lost via submission. That was the second submission loss of his MMA career, the first one since August of 2019. Padilla used that as a springboard to success, taking out another UFC prospect several months later, defeating Rong Zhu at one of the UFC Vegas events within the last 3 months. After that, Llontop fought Vyacheslav Borshev in his last appearance. It was a close fight. Borshev was the favorite in that fight. I'm trying to remember how much of an underdog Llontop was in that spot. He was close to a plus 200 underdog at close. So it was a fight that was lined pretty wide. I didn't think it should have been lined as wide as it was. And I felt pretty vindicated in that based on the way the fight played out. I was disappointed that it seems like a lot of neutral observers felt like Borshev won. I was disappointed that more than one judge didn't see it in Llontop's favor. I was more disappointed that one of the judges scored at 30-27 for Borshev. So it was a split that at least one of the judges thought Llontop got it. When they were reading out the scorecards, I was like, oh, come on, please, see it my way. Even though I know if Llontop had won, there would have been, oh, they robbed Slava Claus. This is bullshit. All right, whatever. We're all on the right and wrong sides of bad split decisions, so it is what it is. But didn't end up getting that one, but still fought to price based on the fact that the fight did at least go to split. Didn't just get rolled over the way I think some people were anticipating was going to happen with Slava Claus. There was at least one person I know on Twitter that put their second mortgage or whatever on Slava and was, talking a bunch of smack afterwards. And it's like, okay, dude, I bet you were shaking in your boots during that split being read out, because that was not, Slava certainly did not fight like a 2-1 favorite. But yeah, I mean, I don't really get what the disrespect is with Llontop, you know? I mean, he was a minus 400 favorite going into that fight with Padilla. And I mean, that fight is just a classic example of why I don't bet when guys are making their UFC debut, when not in terms of Llontop, but in terms of Padilla being the more unknown commodity, because the unknown commodity could come out of nowhere and just, you know, steal it from the guy. But I don't understand why, coming off of a performance where he already defied betting expectations as an underdog, that he's now the second biggest underdog on this card. It's crazy to me. Ruffy, I get why there's been this already anointment, because the fighting nerds are the apple of everybody's eye right now. I'm a little bit confused why he's getting thrust into the same spotlight that Caio Borralho has earned, that Carlos Prates has earned, that Jean Silva has earned. Those guys have all had great years. You could make the argument that Borralho has had the least impressive year out of those three guys. But even he has, you know, firmly established himself as a contender at middleweight. Silva, whatever direction he decides to go, has already demonstrated that he's going to be a problem, and him getting knockouts in, I think, back-to-back events in June this year has already established that guy's very game and live and ready to go. And Prates, obviously, I mean, 4 wins this year. You know, you can't say enough about the guy. Like, he's going to be fun. Whatever ends up happening with him at welterweight, that guy's going to be dangerous. Him versus Ian Machado Gary would be very interesting, I think. But I doubt that the UFC makes that fight happen unless it's for a title, when one of them's already holding the belt. Probably Gary. But in any event, Ruffy hasn't earned the respect yet that those three guys have. And that's coming from somebody that made him a parlay leg at UFC 301, which was, you know, me believing like, yeah, you know, I think this guy impressed enough on Contender Series that I trust him against a guy that has already demonstrated a chin to be fading into being an overachiever of sorts in Jamie Malarkey. But, I mean, Llontop is not Jamie Malarkey in many respects. I mean, he's not Malarkey in the sense that he doesn't have the ground game that Malarkey does. He's certainly not as well-rounded. But Llontop was able to more than hold his own against Borshev in the striking department, and people love to talk about how Borshev is this, you know, super acclaimed kickboxer. So he's able to make fights competitive with proven capable strikers with a lot of experience. Ruffy's only got 11 MMA fights. And in one of them, he got knocked out in the second round against Manuel Souza in 2019. And that fight was at lightweight. He's bounced back and forth between lightweight and welterweight. His Contender Series appearance was at welterweight. And then he moved down to lightweight to fight Malarkey, made the weight, and then he took him out. But Malarkey was never going to be the guy to capitalize on Ruffy's chin the way that Llontop might be here, because Llontop has at least one, if not multiple, one-punch knockouts listed on his resume already at the age of 25. This guy hits. I'm not saying he hits as hard as Ruffy, but in terms of having the capability to put your lights out with one strike, both these guys have that. And the guy that's been knocked out before is the minus 900 favorite in this fight, where neither guy has demonstrated a willingness to put the fight on the ground on their own terms. They both would prefer to just stand and trade. So people are seeing like Ruffy, like, oh, he looks sharp in his striking training footage and whatever. And, you know, he was kind of having some showboaty moments against Malarkey where I think he did some kind of like scissor trip takedown attempt at one point, even though it didn't actually get credited as a takedown. It might have been credited as a takedown attempt, but because he was, you know, doing the scissor, he didn't actually have any way to hold Malarkey down. So Malarkey was able to just get back up. But people were like, oh my God, the fact that he even tried it, like this guy's so savvy. But again, I'm not holding the fact that Ruffy hasn't gone the distance against him, because we already saw, based on Contender Series, that his cardio is going to be able to hold up. I just think that with the way that this fight is lined, I can understand why Ruffy's the favorite. I don't understand at all why he's already being anointed as like a future contender at lightweight. That is literally just people, filleting the fighting nerds. I don't doubt that the gym is elite. I've already baked that into my analysis at this point. But to disrespect a guy like Llontop, who gave a very good account of himself in his last appearance where he was a pretty big underdog, against a guy that is arguably even less proven than Borshev is, that I'm sorry. That's just, this is an insane line to me. I have to take a shot here. I don't know if I'm going to put him in anything other than the moonshot, but this is one of those fights where it's, I just think back, and I try not to brag about it very often because it's like over a year ago at this point. But for the rest of the time that I do this, I'll forever be able to brag that I played Elves Brenner at plus 525 against Guram Kutateladze, which is a pick that almost nobody else had. If you want to hit on an underdog like that, you cannot let the odds scare you in this case. It's been interesting. There's been a conversation happening under the post for the pick that I put out about, somebody said that they thought that, a price for plus 250 in terms of implied odds, not in terms of what they would feel comfortable betting, but in terms of implied odds, would feel that they feel like that would be a more appropriate line for this. And then somebody else who's more of a value-based than a results-based bettor is saying, if you feel like they should be plus 250 and the price tag is plus 600, why are you not playing that? Now, I can understand where the guy that doesn't want to bet it but is putting what they feel are the implied odds, because I primarily look at this from the perspective of being a results-based bettor as well, where I'm more interested in picking winners because I'm not playing straights. I'm playing only parlays. So if one leg gets invalidated, then all of the work gets scrapped. But it's been interesting to watch kind of the exchange between these two relative to this fight, because I think it reflects the fact that most people understand, even though I've not seen anybody else pick Llontop to win this week, most people understand that this fight is inappropriately lined. That even if you think Ruffy should win, this is an outrageous price for a guy given what he's shown and what he's already proven he can lose by, which Llontop has not suffered himself at this point. A bunch of people are picking Ruffy to knock out Llontop, and it's like that'd be the first time Llontop's ever been knocked out. He showed a pretty awesome chin against Borshev, and Borshev is a pretty dangerous striker in his own right, and Borshev couldn't put him away, to the point that Llontop was able to battle back and earn a split decision, albeit a loss. So, look, man, I will say this too. If Llontop doesn't make weight for this because this is short notice, I am probably going to cancel this pick, because if Llontop is not, like, if he's sacrificing purse, his incentive to win this fight goes way down, and he is taking this on short notice. So I am putting that out there. If he can't make the lightweight limit, I am going to be canceling this pick just because it won't be worth it at that point for me. And I'll be, for the kind of grading that I do, that's going to be me taking enough points away from Llontop's grade where I'm going to be considering this even again, and then this is just going to be a stay away. It might be worth looking at the under. I wonder what that is. The under 1.5 rounds is plus 145. So that's very interesting. So the market is guessing that the fight is almost certainly going to go over the halfway point, which Ruffy has only had to do twice in his MMA career, and in one of those cases he lost. So keep that in mind. I don't know if the longer this goes that Llontop is going to look better necessarily, but I do think he's probably going to have a better chance to win in the later stages of the fight if he's able to survive what Ruffy's putting out there, especially if Ruffy does something like chase a finish in the first round and kind of maybe tires himself out doing that. But yeah, this line is just way too wide. And I have enough respect for what Llontop has demonstrated here that, you know what, I don't mind. I spoke earlier in the show about a lot of the lessons that I looked for from other people writing about handicapping MMA fights when I started doing this. And I've got a couple different quotes saved in my spreadsheet just for things to always keep in mind when I'm doing this. And the biggest one that I have that's right under, I take the little screenshots of, you're seeing it right there on of the spreadsheet work that I do every week for plugging the numbers in. And right under that box that I take my screenshots of every week, there's a quote from Piglord, who I referred to earlier in the show. I don't mind looking foolish. This is a long-term game, and consistency is more important than perfection. I don't mind looking foolish is the key term there. I talked about it earlier with Damon Jackson versus Stipe Miocic. Yeah, I'll put out Damon Jackson as an underdog. And yeah, you know what? Maybe he got 30-26 or 30-25. But you know what? Plus money's plus money, and there will be other plus money opportunities that do cash. I don't mind people, if Llontop does get smacked, people are going to say, oh, this was such a stupid play. Ruffy was free money. What were you thinking? What I was thinking was this is an outrageously wide line before the fight happens, and I'm willing to take a speculative shot on it. I'm willing to say that there's enough implied value here relative to what I think the result is that Llontop is able to knock out Ruffy. So that is what I'm going to say happens here. I think that Llontop survives an early onslaught. I think Ruffy overexerts himself going for the finish and is a little bit too showboaty in the first round, and that Llontop is able to gradually turn things around in the second before he finds a shot that knocks down Ruffy. Maybe he gets an early stoppage, but I think he gets a stoppage all the same in the second round. I recognize how dangerous Ruffy is, but I also recognize that this guy's been knocked out before and Llontop hasn't. So the people speculatively saying that he's just going to stop Llontop in the first round, frankly, I just don't see it. I think Ruffy, if he wins, it's probably going to be the first decision of his MMA career. And based on the fact that the fight is expected to last into the second half, based on what the lines for the over and under are, I think that speaks to the fact that people's hypothetical guesses of how this fight is supposed to play off are not aligned with what the expectations really should be. So give me Llontop to win by second round TKO in one of the betting upsets of the year in the UFC. And you heard it here first, unless it doesn't happen. The next fight is Bo Nickal and Paul Craig. I'm not going to spend very long on this one because I'm not playing it and the price tag on Nickal is stupid. But Nickal's 6-0. He fought at UFC 300 against Cody Brundage, and I played an insanely juiced under on that fight because to that point Nickal unders had been free money, and Nickal unfortunately was not able to finish his food in the first half of the fight. Craig conversely got knocked out by Caio Borralho in May of this year at UFC 301. Borralho was a pretty easy parlay leg against Craig at that point. Wasn't really a step up in competition for him the way that this is a pretty considerable step up in competition for Nickal, which makes the price tag kind of insane. Now, just to be clear, I still think Nickal absolutely demolishes this guy. and I would probably feel comfortable playing him out even to like the 400 range. But, I mean, minus 1,200. First of all, this fight opened, Nickal was minus 2,000. And so everybody already was just like, yeah, I got to take speculative shots on Paul Craig, which is funny to me because it's like somebody that bet Paul Craig against Nikita Krylov. It's like, you know, I see so many people reacting so harshly to thinking Llontop is going to beat Ruffy at an almost similar price, but you know, you think that Craig is worth a sprinkle, even with the idea of position over submission and Nickal being the mauler that he is on the ground, that Craig is going to be able to just get into some meme triangle again against this guy that's never been finished, that has the wrestling credentials that Nickal does. Okay. All I really have to say is that, you know, the reason I'm not playing the under here, even though it's at a much better price than what was available at UFC 300, is as crazy as it is to say, Cody Brundage was a step up in competition for Bo Nickal even in that fight. And that little bit of step up in competition was enough to make the fight last into the second half, albeit only by about a little over a minute, but it still went over. And Craig is a much more sophisticated fighter on the ground than Cody Brundage is, or that any of other Nickal's opponents, frankly, to this point have been. I think if Nickal wants to get an early finish, it would probably stand to benefit him to just keep standing and striking because the guy's already proven that he's got power in his hands. But a lot of times when things get weird, fighters just revert to what's most comfortable for them. So it's hard to imagine that Nickal doesn't end up putting this on the ground at some point, which is the world that Craig loves to live in and will gladly. I think even if Nickal ends up putting this on the ground and welcomes him back to his feet at some point, you're going to see Craig very just willingly sitting in guard like, no, let's stay down here. I don't care if you're, you know, wrestling me to exhaustion. I'd much rather just be down here at this point. And that's just going to kill clock, which will have you pulling your hair out, hoping for a Nickal under the way that I did at UFC 300. That ruined what would have otherwise been a profitable day for me. So this is my only stay away on the card. You know, assuming Llontop makes weight, this is a pretty easy stay away for me. And that's really all I have to say about it. I expect Nickal to get a first round finish, but I will not be surprised at all if Craig is able to survive enough if this fight does go to the ground for as long as it potentially could, where Craig is able to avoid taking any significant damage in the first half of the fight before ultimately getting finished. It's totally possible that Craig is able to make this go the distance as he did again against Volkan Ozdemir as well. But in terms of like what my prediction is going to be, I don't really see that happening. This is another served up spot. This is a good logical progression for Nickal in terms of if you're trying to sell this guy as a future star among casuals in the division. This is a good name for him to get. The question is going to be, who do you level him up against after this? A lot of people, it's going to be time maybe within the next couple of years that you could realistically put this guy against Izzy, and that would be interesting to see. Robert Whittaker, I'm sure, would be a very, very interesting fight, particularly after the loss to Chimaev. Fluffy would be very, very interesting, but I hope that they don't actually have those guys fight unless one of them is already holding the belt. So I hope that they don't ruin the rise of either of these guys by making them fight each other at that point. Cannonier could be an interesting name too. But again, he hasn't really had to face a super sophisticated striker yet. So it's going to be interesting to see when he faces some guy with decent takedown defense and much more capable and proven striking experience, what's going to happen. But that's not Paul Craig. Paul Craig is a primarily BJJ practitioner, and against a credentialed wrestler of Nickal's caliber, that is a recipe for disaster. So Nickal should feast here, first round knockout, possibly submission, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if he's not able to quickly finish his food, as what happened when he had to level up in competition against the iconic Cody Brundage. The co-main event at UFC 309 is a rematch between Charles Oliveira and Michael Chandler. Oliveira enters 34-10, last fought at UFC 300, where he lost a split decision to Arman Tsarukyan that I frankly didn't even think was that close, as one of the biggest fans of Do Bronx that exists. I took the under in that fight, so I was just hoping for a finish in the first part. Oliveira got so close in that first round, but unfortunately was just not able to get it done. And Tsarukyan's submission defense looked really, really top-notch, not only in the beginning of that fight, but also at the end of it. It's a shame that he was defending the submission attempt at the end of the fight correctly, but because of the visual that it gave off, it tricked at least one of the judges into scoring the fight in Oliveira's favor, despite the fact that Tsarukyan had a pretty great performance overall. I played another under in Oliveira's fight prior to that. I actually had Beneil Dariush graded to beat him, but as I spoke about on my RAXPOD for UFC 289, I'm not going to bet against my hero under any circumstances. So there's a lot of emotional investment for me in terms of whenever Charles Oliveira is fighting, which I'll get into in a sec. But against Dariush, I said, okay, I don't have to play the favorite here. Feel like he's being overvalued as the favorite anyway, even though I haven't graded a win. Let me take the under, especially because it's at 2.5 rounds. I'm generally not a fan of playing under 2.5 rounds in 3-round fights because, usually I think if it's lined that way, that people are probably expecting there's usually considerable risk for a finish, which is why, at least if the 2.5 rounds at juice is, if you have to play chalk to do the under 2.5 rounds, usually I think it's better to just go with the over at plus odds, because the line is important in terms of expectations relative to where it gets set. The line is usually more important than the odds themselves when you're making plays of that caliber. Makhachev, I like I said, I was too emotionally invested, and I said I'm not going to pick against Charles, and I probably should have, especially because, I talk a lot about how with these super high-level fighters, there's one of the reasons it's good to bet them at the price that you get them at is because in circumstances like that where Makhachev was something like a -160, -180 favorite, is like, if this guy wins this spot, it's going to be a long time before you get him at this price again. Which is part of the reason why I bet Tybura as an underdog against Volkanovski, and also bet Tybura at -235, I think, against Holloway. Tybura is going to be an outrageous favorite now, regardless of who he faces for the next several years. So good luck ever getting that guy's money line at a responsible price again. And then the fight before Makhachev, UFC 274. The first event I ever attended, and I've spoken about it on this show before, but if you have the opportunity to go watch your favorite fighter compete in a big performance in their career, I recommend that you do so. I drove 36 hours from Miami to Phoenix to be at UFC 274. And when I was about 4 hours outside of Phoenix on the last day of my drive out there, I didn't just go out there for the event. I wanted to go hike the Grand Canyon, and I was planning to go up to Denver to visit another friend for a week after that. So I've got, I think, 8 states left now on my my list to check off for all 50 in the U.S. So, and this trip helped me get that number down to 8 because I was able to check off a bunch of ones I had never been to, like Kansas and Oklahoma and some other ones that I hit on the way back to Miami, taking a longer route than I would have otherwise. But the main reason I wanted to go was because I was 3 months into doing my analysis with MMA Rax, and Oliveira was already somebody that was my hero, and I said, I'm never going to have the opportunity, I don't think again, to go see my favorite fighter compete for a UFC title. And then 4 hours before I finished my trip, they stole the belt from DuBronx off the scale. I remember reading that news update like, that is just my luck, man. That is really just my luck, but that's just the way that life is. But you know what? I got to see one of the most spectacular first-round fights ever between that guy and Gaethje. And I got to tell you, watching, especially in an environment where like everybody was pulling for Gaethje except the Brazilian fans, watching that, getting to be there for that moment, to watch one of the best signature moments in the career, with all the controversy swirling around him losing the belt on the scale, watching him get that finish in the way that he did in the comeback is something that I will very much cherish as a sports fan for the rest of my life. And there's really only 2 other moments in terms of things that I've witnessed at a sporting event that I can compare it to. One of them was when Izzy knocked out Pereira at UFC 287, one of the greatest moments in the history of the sport. And I compare it in terms of the crowd pops, because with that one, it was like a crescendo of noise as Izzy was shooting the bow and arrows. But there was a similar level of shock in the building as to when Oliveira, after getting knocked down arguably twice, but at least once against Gaethje, turned the tables, got his own knockdown, and then was able to get the submission. And by the way, I think I mentioned this before, but if you go back and listen to the highlight, like starting from when Oliveira's doing the belt gesture and Cormier saying, "This dude right here, man," if you listen, you can hear in the background a hollering. There's 3 hollers. There's 2 that are in succession, and then there's a break. And then you hear DC go, "This dude is a savage." And right as he's starting to say that, you hear one more big holler, like, "Woo!" That was me. I remember letting out 2 of them in succession right after the result. And I remember thinking I wasn't satisfied with the second one. And so I took a deep breath and I said, this is the only opportunity I'm ever going to have to do this. And I'm so happy with what I just witnessed. I just got to let it out one more time. And I just belted it out. And it was crazy for me that I didn't even realize until I watched the fight almost a year later that got picked up on the UFC audio feed. So I left my own stamp on what was one of the best things that I've witnessed. But between that and the end of UFC 287, the other thing that I witnessed that was pretty spectacular was Michael Chandler soccer kicking Tony Ferguson at the same event. Now, I think it's important to recall that there were 2 fights at UFC 274 that were arguably the worst fights of the entire year in the UFC, and one of them was at least probably the worst title fight that's ever happened, certainly the worst women's MMA fight for a title that's ever taken place. And they both were sandwiched between these 2 absolutely spectacular results that happened that otherwise saved the card. Shogun Rua versus OSP was a disaster. Like, everybody was disinterested. People were openly booing for like the last 10 minutes of the fight and, flashing their phone lights around and stuff. And that fight, like set the table for how strong the reaction was to Namajunas versus Esparza later on. But sandwiched between those two results, what like kept people engaged and interested was Tony Ferguson knocking down Chandler. I don't think it got scored as a knockdown. It didn't, which is unfortunate. But Tony Ferguson having a pretty good showing against Chandler in the first round of their fight, and then Chandler coming back in the second round. And I remember talking to the person next to me about how, my guess for this fight, I think it was at plus odds that I took the plus 1.5 rounds, because Chandler was like a minus 400 favorite or something, and I didn't feel good about that at all. But I was like, I can't pick Tony Ferguson at this point because the guy might be observably washed, but gave a good account of himself. People were chanting, Tony, Tony. They wanted Tony to win. And then when Chandler kicked him, I've never heard a crowd go from that like switched off to switched on that quickly. It was like a bolt of lightning went through the arena. I've never experienced anything like it at any other sporting event. The only thing I can imagine comparing it to is when you hear or see like a game-winning shot, a buzzer beater in the NBA playoffs. But the key difference is you can anticipate that is coming because there's a clock attached to the urgency of the moment when it takes place. This was an out-of-nowhere knockout of the year. I will never, ever forget seeing that. I remember putting both my hand, while I was talking to the guy, I remember putting my hands over my mouth to shut myself up in astonishment right after it happened. And if you go back and watch when Chandler's like sitting on top of the cage and stuff, everybody's doing either some kind of surrender cobra. Nobody's got their arms at their sides. Their arms are either up in the air, on their heads, over their mouth, over their ear. Like, everybody is in universal astonishment. The fact that I got to see those two events at the same pay-per-view, I will forever be grateful that I got to witness both of those moments live. Okay, I've been talking about this for 10 minutes, but my point here is, like, both of these fighters, I have some sort of emotional investment in just because of that. Although I don't really look as favorably upon Chandler as I do Oliveira, obviously. And one of the back when I was doing UFC previews for NOLA.com, the last one I ever did, they didn't let me do any more after this, was because I put out a plus 1,000 prop in the article that I wrote for UFC 281, where I said Dustin Poirier to win in round 3, and that's exactly what happened. It was the first submission loss of Chandler's MMA career, and he hasn't fought for 2 years since, okay? This is a guy that already, I know 2 judges scored the first round of Oliveira-Chandler 10-8 in Chandler's favor, but at that point, that was over 3 years ago at this point, when Chandler was still 35, so starting to hit the decline stage of his career, but not all the way in it. Chandler's now 38 years old and hasn't fought in 2 years, holding out for the McGregor payday, understandably, which unfortunately never came. I hate that this rematch is happening because I recognize how dangerous it is for Oliveira, even if the winner is presumably going to get a title shot after Makhachev faces Sarukian. But the thing is, I don't expect Oliveira to be able to beat Makhachev even in a rematch. And this fight, unfortunately, just has the potential to tarnish legacy in terms of, Oliveira got lucky when the second round started, if he does end up getting dropped by Chandler. At the same time, when people talk about, what's changed between these guys since then, Oliveira is, he's 35 now, so he's starting to hit that probably decline stage of his own career. But this is a guy that still has better momentum in his career right now than Chandler does. Chandler hasn't fought in 2 years, and he's coming off the first submission loss of his MMA career against the most dangerous submission artist in UFC history, the most prolific finisher in UFC history. This is about as bad of a person that you could ask to face coming off of the amount of ring rust that Chandler has. So I don't expect him to have as urgent of a start as he did when he was more more actively competing, just because that's usually what happens with when ring rust is affecting fighters, is that they're more tentative coming out of the gate. And that tentativeness is a recipe for disaster against a guy like Charles Oliveira. But even if he doesn't come out tentative, the urgency without the sharpness that would come from having competed more recently is a similarly disastrous potential outcome for Chandler against a guy like Oliveira. I have Oliveira so strongly graded to win this. And again, I recognize that there's a great deal of emotional bias in my estimation of that happening. But I just hate the fact that this matchup was even made. And even though I feel very, very strongly that Oliveira wins, I recognize that there's a risk of Chandler just sparking him. But Chandler has kind of overexerted himself early on in a lot of his most recent appearances that has led to his downfall as the fight has gradually gone on, regardless of if it's gone to decision or if it has ended up materializing in a finish to Chandler's detriment. So he is, even though most fighters tend to improve their submission defense as they get older, Chandler, having conceded his back and a rear naked choke to Dustin Poirier in his most recent appearance, is a bad, bad, bad signal against an opponent like Oliveira now. So I think Do Bronx probably gets this done. I want to say it's going to happen in the first round. I'll say it happens in the first round. I think that Oliveira is just going to swarm him, and it's going to materialize in a finish either because Chandler's too tentative from the ring rust or because his eagerness without the lack of sharpness is going to put him in a position where he either gets countered or makes a catastrophic mistake that Oliveira is able to capitalize on for a finish. So give me Do Bronx. I will say first round submission, the second submission loss of Michael Chandler's career. And now we come to the main event. Jon Bones Jones and Stipe Miocic. Jones is 27-1. We'll see if that one gets overturned at some point now that 12-6 elbows are legal in MMA. But has not fought since March of 2023 when he tapped out Cyril Gane in the first round. I picked Jones as a favorite in that fight. Again, you go back to when are you going to get this kind of fighter at this kind of price if they win this fight? And you look at minus 175 for Jon Jones. I was like, yeah, you got to take that, man. I don't care how long he's been on the shelf. This is a guy that is regarded by many as the best fighter of all time. Give me that all day. I also took the plus 4.5 in that fight, which, got absolutely trashed. I think I did that just because it was at better odds than the Jones money line. But the Jones money line, that was one of those fights that, people were going to debate for days on end in terms of who they thought was going to win. So many people that picked Gane were so confident that he was going to get it done. For that fight to play out the way that it did, I remember watching it with my brother and talking about how I thought Jon Jones was about to go on a, Michael Jordan second dynasty run at heavyweight. And for him to finish Gane in less than 2.5 minutes, and the only significant damage that he even took was from a groin strike, that was just absolutely unbelievable. Incredible result, particularly coming off the pair of fights where people speculated that he should have lost to Thiago Santos and Dominic Reyes. Just an absolutely bewildering performance and debut at heavyweight for Jon Jones. Conversely, Stipe Miocic got knocked out at UFC 260, hasn't fought since. He enters 20-4, but is on one of the longest stretches of ring rust I think I've seen since I started doing this. I think the only two comparable layoffs that I've seen that are this long, the longest I've ever seen was when Alex Reyes came back against Charlie Campbell. I can't remember if it was earlier this year or at some point last year, but I think it was last year. Reyes hadn't fought for 6 years. Like it was extremely, which makes it incredible that, you know, he came back and fought even this year against Tom Nolan. But I remember thinking that was the longest layoff that I had ever seen, and probably would. It's probably going to be a while before we see somebody else come back from a 6-year layoff, and you have to imagine that his affiliation to Dominic Reyes probably helped pay some dividends there in terms of retaining his UFC contract and not medically retiring during that stretch. The only other one that I think compares to the layoff that Miocic has here is Benito Lopez when he came back to fight Mario Batista in 2022. I think at that point Lopez had been off for a little over 3 years and had started moonlighting as an insurance salesman and got cut from the UFC after losing by first-round submission to Mario Batista. So in both cases where there have been similar layoffs, in terms of length for the underdog, both of the underdogs got finished in the first round of their respective fights. Yeah, I have to be honest. Like, I understand that among, like, the most diehard fans, this is still a very compelling matchup. This would have been, even if this fight had taken place last year, I still wouldn't have been terribly interested in it just because Miocic would have been 41, still with a long layoff. I would have been having the same read on it a year ago that I have on it now for the same reasons. And now that it's just been delayed, the inevitable has been further delayed out, I still have the same read on it. We're talking about, it is in a purely hypothetical sense, this is arguably the greatest fighter in MMA history competing against the guy that has had the most successful run at heavyweight in UFC history. But one of those guys hasn't fought in 3 years and is now 42 years old. And I think that people are wishfully ignoring the age factor here, just because there's been an eagerness to see this fight happening. And look, age is the most significant variable in all of this. You know, it's why in a hypothetical match that's probably not going to happen now, but when people were offering odds on a potential Mark Zuckerberg versus Elon Musk match, Zuck is a guy that I think is in his mid-late 30s compared to Musk being in his 50s. And even though Musk is a much larger man than Zuckerberg is, and Zuckerberg's combat sports background is primarily Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which is, you know, still presumably more training than Musk has had in any discipline, Zuck was like a minus 500 betting favorite. I think it had more to do with age than anything else. That's why it surprises me that the Jake Paul-Mike Tyson line is as close as it is. Tyson is scraping 60 years old. The speed is not going to be there from when Iron Mike was competing in the ring. It's just not. And the minute he starts to take any compromising shots to the head, the brain is going to shut off in a way that is, I think, going to devastate a lot of boxing fans. As someone that's not particularly a fan of boxing, I'll enjoy whatever happens because I don't particularly like Jake Paul, but I also don't like a lot of these boxing supremacists that, insist that the sport is still better and has a higher ceiling than MMA. And I won't enjoy seeing Mike Tyson lose to Jake Paul, but I will enjoy seeing all of these boxing fans wishfully thinking that he might knock the guy out, getting in their feelings because they saw their hero get downed by a YouTuber. So, but anyway, getting back to this fight. As I said earlier, in the last 2 years, the two most comparable layoffs to what Miocic has, the underdog has gotten finished in the first round in both cases. And Miocic is coming off a knockout loss in which he got folded by a lawn chair. Folded like a lawn chair, I should say. I know Jones hasn't been a power striker his whole career. It's the one thing his MMA tool set has been missing. But the guy is elite everywhere else. And I spoke earlier in this card referring to Tybura versus Diniz that asking a heavyweight in the twilight stages of their career to reliably wrestle for more than one round is almost certainly going to gas out the older fighter in many, many, many cases. I don't see why that wouldn't be the case here. There's people that are trying to say, oh, Miocic is in great shape or whatever, but the guy is 42 years old. 42. Facing a guy that, against someone that many people picked him to lose, and certainly just in terms of athletic appearance and capability, Gall is a world-class guy, and Jones totally just drowned out Gall in a way that I think a lot of people didn't really expect. Nobody expected Jones to put that fight on the ground as quickly as he did. And the fact that he was capable of doing that, I'm sorry, there's no way that Miocic is going to have the ability to provide as much resistance, regardless of technical ability, at the age and stage of his career that he's at, that Gall would have even had against Jon Jones, even though Gall really didn't know what he was doing in terms of defending the standing guillotine choke from that position. I think Miocic is just being fed to Jones for dinner here. I don't expect this fight to be competitive in any sense. I think even Miocic is just looking at I don't know how realistic Miocic can really be looking at this, saying that I have a legitimate shot to be champion here against, overcoming the greatest fighter in MMA history that has only ever lost by disqualification. He's kind of in an impossible situation. It's just that the UFC has been so particularly Dana White has been so insistent on making this fight happen that they probably made Miocic an offer that he can't refuse financially. So I think Jones is gonna just really maul him pretty bad. I was stunned when I looked at this fight and saw that the line on the over-under is 2.5 rounds. I thought heavyweight fight almost certainly is going to be plus or minus 1.5. No way I'm betting Jon Jones at 700, even though I have him graded out to like 500 range in this fight. 700 is it's a little bit too much for me, unfortunately. If he were down closer to 500, I think, honestly, you could probably throw him in any parlay and feel pretty good about it. But then I looked at the over-under because, like I said, I've got the rule to my own detriment that I've always got to have a pick for the main event. If I were to stay away from a main event, it would feel contrary to the spirit of why I'm doing this to begin with. I could not believe that the over-under is lined at 2.5 rounds. I know it's a 5-round fight, but given everything that I just laid out, I could not believe that this was lined at 2.5 rounds. And that's coming from somebody that took the over on Jon Jones when he was coming back against Ciryl Gane. One of the things that people talk about, it's kind of underwhelming with the heavyweight division, is that so much of the action takes, there's not the well-roundedness at heavyweight up and down the division and the roster that there is in other divisions. There's a big lack of sophisticated ground game from a lot of these fighters. And I know that wasn't the case for Miocic when, he was going through the trilogy with Daniel Cormier. But again, this is a guy that hasn't fought in 3 years, that is facing now somebody that offers arguably just as dangerous of a wrestling threat and probably is even a more lethal finisher on the ground than Cormier was, at 42 years old. I think Jones is going to be all over him in the first round. And I think that Miocic probably is at least not totally out of it, but coming back into the second round, facing the prospect of, having to take this sustained amount of damage from this guy that is clearly not in the prime of his career, but still just levels above him at this point. I think that Jones is probably going to get all over him in the second round. And I think it's possible that we see Miocic's first submission loss of his MMA career. But what I think is even more realistic is that given the recent rule change, I can see Jones wanting to make a statement about having that one loss on his record avenged by winning this fight in the same way that he was disqualified in the only loss of his career. I could see him getting mount on Miocic and just, you talk about the most dangerous users of elbows in MMA history. Jones has to be at the top of that list. The guy uses his length so well in terms of using the elbows, not only in ground and pound, but in standing and clinch exchanges. I think that he's going to make a point of now having the 12-6 available to him. I can see him very easily using that to get a knockout here in a way that puts Miocic out in the first half of this fight. Give me Jon Jones to win by second round knockout from 12-6 elbows and make a statement to the athletic commissions in America about getting that loss overturned earlier in his career. And I think that given the comfort he has expressed with facing Alex Pereira, we're probably going to see that fight at International Fight Week, champion versus champion, next year in Vegas in 2025. So that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 309. Thank you very much for sticking around this long. We will be back for UFC 310 on December 7th. If you caught my whole intro, then you heard the little personal update that I gave. I am going to be working at that by that point during that first week. Full-time writer, editor gig for a publicly traded company. So it's going to be, I'm going to have I'll have the RAXPOD available, but it's like I said, in terms of doing any kind of like minute to win it breakdowns, we'll see what happens for UFC Macau. Given I know there's more than a few fights that I'm super interested in on that card. But in terms of anything for Machado, Gary, Buckley afterwards, I wouldn't get your hopes up too much. But the RAXPOD will be back for UFC 310. You might see me a little bit more tired than usual just because of the hours I'm going to be keeping at that point. But thank you very much for tuning in. Please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for staying loyal fans of the platform and for the work that I put in. It's always very, very rewarding for me, even on weekends when I don't profit myself, to see people reach out to me and tell me that I helped them make several thousands of dollars that weekend. Makes me feel good, makes me want to continue the work that I'm doing here. And, that post that I read out at the beginning of the show, I think I'm a pretty capable sports writer at this point. I've already got, like I said, I've done production for USA Today and the Herald. I've got another gig at the biggest platform possible for the team that I cover outside of this as well. I have another podcast that I do also for that. If you're, I happen to have any crossover fans, which I have to imagine there's maybe at least one. But, I think I am a capable pontificator on multiple sports at this point. I've proven that to get to the level that I've had over the last 10 years. I'm at least a good enough writer that I can go get a full-time writing gig from a publicly traded company. So, you know, that was just a little bit of a taste, that post I wrote about the Apex last week, of what I hope to regularly be doing within the next 5 years on this platform as more and more people get drawn to it. So if you were around for the early stages of what I affectionately have been referring to as the MMA Rax and the RAXPOD beta, thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll be back for UFC 310. Until then, please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you very much for your support. And yeah, I look forward to continuing to do this for you guys through my early 30s and beyond. Now I've got to go get ready to celebrate a birthday tomorrow. Take care, folks.